Chapter 1946. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 1946. Fireflies. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The Constellation Biyao alliance was quite spread out. Although they had sent many, they could only enter in pairs of 2, and each family only sent a single representative. However, among the devices they prepared to exchange for once they entered, there were communication devices that would make their coming together much simpler and easier. As such, by the time the first day of the air wars began to wane, there were quite a number that had come together. When this number was combined with the number they had exchanged for through their kills, they were slowly approaching nearly 1,000 members. However, what was especially ridiculous was that they couldn't cross into a certain territory. In the beginning, they had only sent 1 or 2 at a time, trying to see if there was a path to sneak in. However, those that were luckier were quickly forced to retreat under a barrage. Those that were unlucky, however, directly lost their lives. The only option seemed to be to move forward with a larger group, but it was difficult to organize such a thing without a sure leader, and there was only one person who would take up such a role. As the day waned, Nazag finally appeared. A group of elites of the Terius family followed close behind him. They seemed to have already been outfitted with all of their equipment, and among this equipment there was what they had lacked the most: quivers and arrows. Nazag frowned when he saw the state of his people. Lionel wasn't the only one who could plan ahead. The original intention of the people of the Constellation Biyao alliance was to gather together as quickly as possible. In the meantime, Nazag would form an elite team and clear as many challenges and gather as many points as he could. In his absence, his people were meant to capture a village and then quickly clear out the territory, so that when he came with enough points, they could directly challenge the bronze grade and take a step into it as swiftly as possible. Nazag's strategy wasn't bad. Not wasting his time finding and claiming a territory maximized his skill set, and after a day, he had already accumulated several 10,000 points and he was already close to having enough to trigger the silver grade challenge. In his estimation, by midday tomorrow, they should be firmly entrenched and they could begin using their silver grade territory as a springboard to attack other territories, expand, and gather more wealth, resources, and points. Everything should have been perfect, but Nazag, we weren't able to clear out the entire territory. Every time we try to go in that direction, we're barraged by a long-ranged weapon. 6 of our brothers and sisters have already died trying. There's definitely another territory over there, but since the plan was to clear the region first, we couldn't make the decision alone. Nazag frowned before making a prompt decision. Everyone gather. Organize yourself. We will attack now, there's no time to waste. Nazag had a bad feeling. An enemy that could set up such a thing so quickly wasn't a joke. The fact that 6 had already fallen on just the first day was also a hard pill to swallow. There were just shy of 1,000 of them. A casualty count of 6, not even mentioning the number injured, was already too high. The Constellation Biyao alliance quickly formed up, but before they could even set out, there was a sudden shout. Leader! Leader! A large army has entered the range of our territory. Nazag's frown deepened. I didn't tell you to start the bronze grade upgrade yet. What are you doing? No. There's Dash. Before the voice could finish, the darkening skies were suddenly enveloped by a violet brilliance. Roar! A streaking arrow of fire descended from the skies. It was just a single line of red, splintering the black skies in 2. Even so, it felt tiny and insignificant. Until it hit the ground. Boom! The fires raged, shooting up into the skies and forming a pillar of devastation before a rain of flames fell from above, immediately turning the surroundings into a hellscape of heat and agony. Nazag's pupils constricted, and his vision sharpened, streaking across the skies until it landed on Lionel's face. His heart skipped a beat, his gaze shifting down to land on the army of 10,000. No matter how hard he thought, he couldn't fathom out Lionel had already gathered so many subordinates. But even more importantly than that, how were they all wearing such armors already? All of those armors were silver grade at worst. To trade for that, it would take 100 points each, one for the armor, and another for the weapon. That was 200 points per person, for 10,000 people that was 2 million points. That was simply impossible. When Nazag saw that many of the weapons and armors were actually in the gold grade, his face went completely dark. Could it be that the Morales were cheating so boldly under the eyes of everyone? There was already no more time to think. Ready your bows. We must use our advantage while we can. Ready and aim. Fire. Nazag had already organized his people for battle. In this relatively flat and dry terrain, there weren't any obstructions to worry about. Even if their village was burning to the ground, so what? So long as they could get off 3 or 4 volleys, this battle would quickly become manageable. The Oryx were on foot, so their charging speed was relatively slow. In addition, there didn't seem to be any shield warriors, or more importantly, platoons among them. Without a collective effort to shield against their arrows, they would have to fend for themselves. That would cause their formation to collapse and make them easy pickings. Nazag thought through things swiftly and then lifted his bow, ready to fire. The first volley launched into the skies like fireflies sweeping through the night sky. But to their shock, their lights suddenly flickered and vanished as though swallowed into the belly of a black dragon. Chapter 1947. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 and 22 p.m. Chapter 1947. Not worth anything if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The violet dragon snaking through the skies suddenly whipped its tail, causing the few arrows that had been launched into the skies to snap beneath the wind pressure alone. Nazag's eyes widened in shock. His first thought, once again, was some sort of cheating. This was a world created by a Morales ancestor, after all, and it was designed to distort their senses from the very beginning. Maybe it could mess with their attacks as well. However, somewhere deep inside, Nazag knew that this wasn't the case. He raised his bow into the skies, his heartbeat slowing. After the first volley failed, leaving him and his people stunned, the Oryx were still quickly closing the gap. In just a few more moments, they would be upon them. Nazag realized that maybe the only way to salvage this situation was to kill Lionel. He's about 100 meters up and 3 kilometers away. This is a routine shot. Nazag took a breath. Reaching into his quiver, he pulled out a radiant white arrow and pulled. His bow trembled once and ancient runes began to light up across its body. A white bow force erupted from him, spiraling around his arrow and shifting his hair like the wind. Die. Nazag released with an exhale. It whistled through the sky with a harsh sound, gathering momentum as it moved until it seemed to become 2 arrows spiraling around one another. This was Nazag's most powerful single-shot technique, at least the most powerful one he frequently used. It could be considered an excellent probing shot. His eyes narrowed as his arrow seemed to appear before Lionel in the blink of an eye. The entire world seemed to be focused on this exchange, however Lionel's expression was indifferent and unmoved. As he stood on the back of his dragon construct, his pale violet hair shifted in the wind. The arrow appeared before his eyebrows, but just when it seemed like his head would be penetrated, exploding for all to see, the arrow suddenly crumbled. The bow force vanished and the arrow that was left fluttered away in a rain of ash. Nazag froze, his hand trembling. Lionel looked down toward him without a word. The deep abyss of those pale violet eyes were suffocating. Despite the distance that separated them, it felt like they were face to face. As Nazag craned his neck and Lionel calmly met his gaze, the difference between them seemed all too obvious. Roar! The Oryx army crashed into the Constellation Bow Alliance's formation. Realizing that their bow force had suddenly become useless, they could only use their bows as sticks, relying on their fists and legs to counter. But what good was it? Outside of Nazag and his small group that held up well, countering and killing a few Oryx, against the mighty and strong bodies of the Oryx who had recently undergone hyper-evolution, they stood little chance at all. Nazag's gaze turned red as his people were slaughtered. Lionel didn't seem to care to raise even a single finger. He simply looked down with the loftiness of a king. For those on the outside who had watched Lionel meticulously measure every second, ensuring that not a moment was wasted, this was a sharp contrast to his usual tactics. However, it was exactly this sharp contrast that made it all the more glaring. He was doing it on purpose. He wanted this moment to be burned into their memories. It was a message that when he spoke arrogantly, it wasn't because he did as he willed and didn't comprehend the vastness of the world. It was because he had already prepared, it was because he was already 10 steps ahead, it was because he was already confident that others could never catch up to his steps. Lionel. Nazag roared. I'll never forgive your Morales family for doing this. Lionel looked down indifferently. As smart as he was, he could tell why Nazag was saying this. He could not wrap his head around how any of this could be happening if Lionel wasn't cheating. Cheating was the only viable answer he had. Lionel did not have to acknowledge his words at all, however at that moment, he suddenly raised a hand. The oryx, who had flooded forward like an endless tide, came to a halt, retreating just as smoothly. They were a well-oiled machine, responding to Lionel's commands without the slightest hitch. Lionel took a step forward, fluttering down from the back of his dragon construct as his bow appeared in his hand. When he landed, the two armies had already separated, leaving a no-man's land. His location was as dangerous as it could be, and yet he was unmoved by it all. He took the white lion bow off of his back, piercing it into the ground. With a wave of his hand, the bow of a fallen Constellation Bow Alliance member shot up from the ground and snapped into his palm with a satisfying clap. Without a word, he pulled back on the bow string, a radiant golden bow force forming. The instant Nazag saw this, his expression went from one of derision to shock and then helplessness, before it suddenly became fierce. He gripped his bow and lifted it up, roaring as he pulled back the string and released. Twang! Lionel shot an arrow at the same time, meeting Nazag's and dispelling it. Nazag shot again, but Lionel's arrow crossed the halfway mark even faster this time, colliding with its tip perfectly and shattering it. Nazag shot again and again, but every time, Lionel's arrow would meet it. It didn't seem to matter how it twisted, how it curved, or which direction it came from. The aerial assault between the two formed a net of white and gold in the skies, illuminating the dark skies. But as time passed, the golden arc quickly suppressed the white arcs. Lionel didn't move an inch, and his firing speed didn't seem to increase, and yet Nazag was quickly being suppressed and suffocated. Soon, his arrow could barely travel a few meters before they're destroyed. Then they could not even travel a meter. Then not even half a meter. Nazag pulled back his bow to fire again, but a golden arrow whizzed forward, shredding his bow apart and snapping it into two. The arrow shot into his shoulder, leaving a hold so large that half of his mangled, beating heart could still be seen. Lionel did not even look at Nazag, tossing the random bow he had picked up to the side and picking up the white lion bow. At that moment, the white lions of the bow unleashed a mighty roar that shocked the skies. It swallowed up Lionel's bow force, emitting a mightier and mightier aura until it finally unshackled the last of its chains. The aura of the gold grade crumbled and the aura of the true life grade weapon burst forth. Lionel calmly strapped the bow to his back as Nazag looked forward, blood spilling from his mouth. I'm not sure why you all thought you were worthy of this bow, Lionel uttered lightly. Kill the rest of them, they're not worth anything. Roar. The oryx charged, their gazes crimson with endless fervor. Chapter 1948. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 1948. Night side. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The lips of the Constellation Bow Alliance elders trembled as they watched the light fade from Nazag's eyes. It was a complete slaughter, he never stood a chance. The worst humiliation was that Lionel hadn't even used the white lion bow. All the while, it was stuck in the ground by his side and he suffocated Nazag with nothing more than sheer skill. If he had wanted, Nazag wouldn't have been able to gather up any bow force at all. This was the fundamental difference between a fake sovereign and a true sovereign. Back then, Lionel could only rely on someone actually attacking him with a spear to crush their spear force. However, now, not only were spears, bows and arrows useless against him, he could even extend this ability into a domain that crushed all opposition. Nazag might have believed that Lionel was cheating, but the rest of them had all seen the process from start to end with their own eyes. If Lionel had been cheating, or if the Morales had made his path forward easier, they would have been able to sense it. There was no escaping it, Lionel had crushed them. Then when their best genius complained, he gave him a chance and then crushed him again. From the very beginning, the fact the Constellation Bao Alliance used the Bao had sealed their fates. This was never their stage, and it was their misfortune to be placed near Lionel. Death was always the only path forward. Ancestor Mito trembled. His grip on the flagship tightened to the point the metal within his palms turned molten. He had a belly full of fury, but he didn't know where to aim it. He never expected that the Constellation Bao Alliance would be the first major power to be eliminated like this. Even the Gold Dark organization still had others inside, though they had already lost their strongest pair. This humiliation would follow them for a lifetime. Lionel returned to the skies, landing by Aina's side as the massacre below was swiftly completed. Aina's gaze was placid, however she still asked a question. Will it really be all right? She was obviously referring to Lionel's ruthless methods. He truly seemed intent on killing every genius he came across, even the heirs. In the past air wars, heirs always survived, firstly because of the Morales family rules, and second because there were mechanisms in place for them to give up ahead of time and be transported out. This was a measure provided this time as well. The difference was that Lionel didn't give them a chance. He killed the Gold Dark brothers before they even realized the kind of threat they were facing, and he spit in the face of Nazag's pride, placing him in a position where his only thoughts were of clawing back his dignity. However, those that came to support the heirs were fair game. This was supposed to be a measurement of the charisma of the heir. Who would be able to gather up subordinates who knew that their lives would be in danger, while their leader would never have to face death himself? But now it had become the burial ground so many geniuses had fallen to. I want them to be enraged, I want them to retaliate. I want them to be so infuriated that they lose all logic and reason. That way, once we step foot out of here, I can unify the human domain in a single bound. Aina's gaze flashed. She had wondered why Lionel had been so serious from the very beginning. It turned out his goal was never these air wars to begin with. Lionel was a person who took his preparation seriously, yes. He had always taken his two mantras, respect and persistence, to the absolute extreme. However, it was also because of this preparation that he tended to be lackadaisical and casual in his execution. This time, it was different though. From the moment he opened his eyes this morning, there was an unconcealed sharpness around him. Even James didn't dare to joke around at this point, and everyone had their best brought out of them. Lionel's demeanor had become like a guiding light in the dead of night. Everyone was in lockstep, they could subtly feel the kind of momentum that was brewing. This wasn't just the air wars. This was the start of the domain war. On the other side of the air war moon, most of the participants were oblivious to the looming threat. The sun was still high in the skies on this side as it had started off in the dead of the night. The disadvantage was that claiming villages in the dark was far more difficult as many had buffs during this time to their alertness. At the same time, there were far more creatures and barbarians spawned in the wild. However, it could be argued that these two changes actually made those who were spawned on the night half of the moon far luckier. Only Lionel had been focused on claiming a territory as quickly as possible. Most were more concerned with gathering points, clearing challenges, and completing kill exchanges. With the added number of spawned creatures that could be slaughtered, the size of groups on the night side had surpassed that of the day side. Of the 7 heirs, 4 were located on the night side, while 3 were located on Lionel's half of the moon. Adderworth had already gathered over 100 subordinates. Although this number paled in comparison to the near 1,000 that the Constellation Bao Alliance had, it had to be remembered that the Alliance had only gathered this amount because they had multiple heirs participating, while Adderworth was on his own. What was curious, though, was the fact the heir performing the best on the night side wasn't Adderworth the first Nova, but rather the third Nova, Zavnik, who had suddenly exploded with a great potential. Almost the moment they entered, several heirs seemed to have betrayed their families, rushing toward Zavnik's location. By the end of the first day, they had already built a coalition of over 2,000. Chapter 1949. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 and 3 seconds p.m. Chapter 1949. Loopholes. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Zavnik's actions should have gotten far more praise than they did. He, almost rightfully, thought himself to be leading the pack. He had taken advantage of an obvious loophole in the rules, but taking advantage of this loophole wasn't simple. Those that participated needed to come from prominent families, and he also had to convince not just the participants themselves to follow him, but even the powerful elders behind them that following his steps was in their best interest. With the fact that the Morales family were quickly becoming the public enemy of the human domain, especially as Lionel continued his slaughter, how could such a thing be simple? In fact, it was so difficult that it bordered on impossible. Pulling this off, especially given the short time that was given, was a feat of feats. Not only had this allowed Zavnik to accumulate a large number of subordinates in the shortest period of time, but he had also claimed 3 territories already. Although they were all still at the subgrade, this was done on purpose by him. He didn't want to grab too much attention too soon. His goal was to covertly gather up enough points and resources to push all 3 territories to the silver grade by the end of the second day. By then, he would be leagues beyond anyone else. In fact, the only ones aware that he had gathered such an army beneath him already were those who were watching from the outside. From the perspective of those on the night side, everything was normal. On the day side, the 2 other heirs outside of Lionel were 5th Nova, Ramon, and 2nd Nova, Oren. Interestingly enough, Ramon had taken a very similar approach to Lionel, just much slower. When he found a village, he and his partner, Valerie, got to work. After clearing the village, work that Valerie seemed to take charge of practically alone, Ramon entered the center console of the village and brought out a workbench and a force crafting quill. He had made the same decision as Lionel. Trading for individual treasures was too expensive, he would craft his way out. While he worked, Valerie used the territory map to find challenges and clear them quickly, even entering a dungeon on her own. This valiant woman seemed to have a spear that was unstoppable. Nothing could seem to last even a single strike, and she swept through everything she came across. By the end of the first day, they had nearly 100 subordinates as well, and each and every one was outfitted with gold-grade armors and weapons. Then, in the dead of night, they directly challenged the bronze-grade upgrade. As for Oren, his approach seemed to be the oddest of them all. He completely ignored the villages despite the fact that he had come across 2 unclaimed ones on the first day. He and his partner seemed to vanish into the shadows, making their position hard to lock on even for those watching. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact you could find whichever candidate you wanted to check on with just a thought, even they might have already lost track of him. However, it was also due to this that Oren was easy to forget, especially with all of the other fireworks. As such, many only checked on him every few hours, not having the patience to give him their full attention, and it was because of this that no one seemed to have a grasp of what he was doing. The heirs weren't the only ones of the day side, half of the constellation families were also present. Of them, the Leo family and the Gamine families were performing the best. The Leo family were entirely focused on the brute force method. They had placed their 2 best geniuses, Conan and Gunter, on the same team. Both had only recently entered the 7th dimension, but their strength made many veterans shrink, their power output splitting and trembling the earth. They had by far the smallest group at not even a dozen, but this wasn't due to their lack of kills. Outside of Lionel, Adderworth, and the cumulative efforts of Zavnik's coalition, they likely had the most. However, they had converted all of these kills directly to points, first outfitting themselves with their best weapons and armors long since prepared, and then, strangely, pairing themselves with beast companions. Beast companions fell under a unique category. They could be exchanged for using both kill exchanges or like treasures, it depended on the individual's choice. But what was interesting was the Leo family first traded in all of their kills for points, then traded for their beasts. This move was clever because the cost of their beasts was less than that of what they received for the kills. However, the question was, why would the Leo family be trading for such weak beasts to begin with? Obviously, the more talented the beast, the more it cost. For their beasts to cost so little, they couldn't be very talented at all. But when the elders on the outside saw these beasts, their eyes widened. These beasts were indeed not talented, they could even be said to be inferior. The amount of effort it would have taken to raise them to the 7th dimension simply wasn't worth the return. And yet, each and every one of them was the middle 7th dimensional tier, tier 4 at worst, tier 6 at best. Even the strongest participating heir was only at tier 2. The 100-year limit on age was devastating, and each step taken in the 7th dimension could be counted as its own watershed, let alone if you were crossing tier 3 to tier 4, or tier 6 to tier 7. These gaps were enormous. But now the Leo family had taken advantage of their own loophole in the rules to bring out such powerhouses for cheap. It was clear and obvious that they had invested a great deal. For the cost it would have taken to raise beasts of such poor talent, they could have raised dozens of geniuses with just decent talent to that level, hundreds maybe. The approach of the Gamine family, though, was just as clever and resourceful. Chapter 1950. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 1950. Fusion. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The Leo family's methods were already excellent. While the age limit of humans was 100 years, the age limit of beasts was the exact same. If they weren't, then wouldn't that mean that these families could just send any 8th dimensional beasts they had in? They had obviously planned for this long ago. Just looking at the beasts, it was clear that they wouldn't be able to live much longer than another 2 or 3 years, a price paid for such fast improvement, which was also likely why they hadn't used such methods on humans. As for the Gamine family, they paired themselves quite oddly. Usually, the Gamine family geniuses would be born in pairs. When their women released eggs, their special bloodlines, once said egg was fertilized, would cause them to split into a yin and a yang. This would produce twins that were almost identical in every aspect, but not quite identical. These twins would be the perfect battle partners and could communicate across exaggerated distances. This was why it was so weird, initially, that rather than pairing these yin and yang twins together, the Gamine family had sent in 2 pairs of geniuses, pairing 2 yangs and 2 yins. One pair of these twins were ones that Lionel had intimate familiarity with as they had entered the same selection village as him back then. Juan and Droit, Juan being the white-haired and dark-skinned yin twin, and Droit being the black-haired and white-skinned yang twin. However, in this case, they were separated, matching with Hewlett, a yin twin, and Druid, a yang twin. Hewlett and Druid were a pair of sisters, while Juan and Droit were a pair of brothers. The two could be considered cousins, with Hewlett and Druid being in a middle generation between the Cataclysm generation and Velasco's generation. When the 2 pairs entered, they split once again. But rather than meeting up with their partners, they picked a point and fanned out. Using their communication abilities, they built territory maps between the 2 of them larger than any city, far larger than even Lionel's one. In just a day, they had mapped out the entire day side, finding all currently occurring challenges and taking down all those nearby them. If there was a number 1 group in terms of challenges cleared, it was no doubt the Gamine family. The number of points they had accumulated had already long entered the hundreds of thousands and their understanding of the situation was excellent. As for how they had done this, they used their internal sight like radars. Because they could connect while disregarding the distance, their internal sight connected like a singular line across hundreds and even thousands of kilometers. Then, by pouring their soul force to reinforce the strand of connection, they could send subtle waves into the surroundings, mapping it out like radio waves. Although the maps weren't in striking detail, they didn't need to be. This alone was enough for them to know the location of every challenge, every dungeon, and every village on an entire half of the moon. After this, they picked the most prime location on the day side, a village with the best natural resources and defenses. In addition, this was a village that started at the bronze grade from the very beginning. After claiming it, they used the kill exchanges they had gathered to gather up dozens of subordinates. Then, giving them the location of the dungeons they had already mapped out, they sent them out, only leaving a small number to protect their territory. The most shocking part about their strategy was that as they brought forward more and more of their family methods, their ability to scan the region got faster and faster, even having teams dedicated to updating them with the new spawns. Although their start was relatively slow, their efforts seemed to be quickly snowballing, and it was only increasing in speed. It was safe to say that there were others performing quite excellently, although Lionel was still in first place. If he couldn't continue pushing forward at this pace, he would be quickly surpassed before he could take advantage of the lead he currently had. But knowing Lionel, how could he allow such a thing to happen? Even as the oryx completed the rest of the slaughter, Lionel entered the center of the subgrade village with Aina, his thoughts dancing. 500 million points was incredibly steep, and the prices beyond that would only become steeper and more exaggerated to the point that they might take years to accumulate. There was no simple method to accumulate so many points. Grinding was the only option. However, there was another path to advancement, and that was fusing cities. By combining 3 city cores of the same grade, you could trigger an upgrade challenge. The drawback was that the upgrade challenge would be more difficult as a result, the enemies would be marginally stronger, and much more numerous. It would be akin to triggering 3 upgrade challenges simultaneously. Lionel had already decided that this would be his right, but the when was difficult. He simply didn't have enough subordinates, especially compared to these families who had billions of descendants per generation. As a result, he needed to not only end these air wars before they had enough time to accumulate too many kill exchanges for him to handle, he could also only have just a single large territory because he couldn't adequately defend more than that while also maintaining pressure on his enemies. Still, the question remained, would he fuse 3 silver-grade cities? Or would he fuse 3 gold-grade cities together? Lionel shook his head, there was only one choice. With a wave of his hand, he spent all the points they had just accumulated and triggered the bronze-grade and silver-grade challenges back to back. With an army of 10,000 ready and prepared, they steam-rolled through the both. After this, there was only one path left, and that was to find another silver-grade city core to fuse into his own. As Lionel was making his choice, the Gamine were communicating. Since they had mapped out the entire day side, they had long since found Lionel's territory, but they hadn't taken action just yet. Their original plan after seeing how close the constellation Biyao alliance and Lionel were was to allow the two of them to fight it out and let them reap the rewards as they focused on other things. But very soon, they would receive news of their destruction as the scouts assigned to that region swept through once more. Chapter 1951. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 1951, 20% if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again, the constellation Biyao alliance has been destroyed. Although it's not confirmed, Nazag has likely died along with them. It doesn't seem like any but a few who used their escape badges managed to keep their lives. A scout reported to the 4 Libra heirs, a solemn expression on their face. Author's note, mistake on my part. The 4 heirs that were introduced in yesterday's chapters are part of the Libra family, not the Gamine family. Apparently I can't keep my own story straight, cries in corner. The Gamine and Libra family have a very close relationship with one another, something mentioned back in Vol 7. Apparently, that relationship is close enough that I mixed them up. It was obvious that after learning of the claiming of 2 territories, they would pay a great amount of attention to them. The commotion caused by Lionel wasn't small in the slightest, and it was too difficult to hide an army of 10,000. In addition, there's been a change to Lionel Morales' territory as well. A mountain seems to have appeared out of nowhere, and it's gone from a territory that's difficult to defend to one that has an incredible terrain advantage. We aren't sure of how this happened. The 4 heirs frowned, looking toward one another. They had only just returned, prepared to press their advantage. They wouldn't be together considering the advantage they had when separated if it wasn't for something extremely important, and that important thing was obviously upgrading their territory. However, what they didn't expect was that the moment they returned, they would receive what could only be said to be bad news. They weren't exactly close to Lionel's territory, in fact they were quite far. The land Lionel had chosen was quite barren and could only be salvaged with the help of several terrain-changing rewards. However, their territory was lush and vibrant, there was a huge climate change between there and here. Even so, because of the way the air wars seemed to be shaping up, there would likely be a victor decided between the 2 hemispheres before an overall was chosen between the 2 behemoths that remained on their feet. This was almost guaranteed because the moon was currently separated into two supercontinents, one on the night side and the other on the day side. It wasn't worthwhile to invest in seafaring vessels and the like to cross to the other side if it wasn't absolutely necessary. It would only slow their progress, all for what? To end up in a land they had no information about. It wasn't worth it. Mountain? It should be a dungeon reward. There was a dungeon located between Lionel Morales territory and the Constellation Biyao Alliances. It was closer to the Constellation Biyao Alliance's territory, so it's surprising that Lionel Morales got his hands on it first, Hewlett said slowly. Juan and Droit were silent. They were the two with the most understanding of Lionel. They could still remember the first time they met him. He had started off with quite a disadvantage in the true selection as well, but what had happened in the end? Since then, they had been quite wary of him. For him to end up with the dungeon first. Is it a coincidence? From our most recent scan, he seemed to have been alone with his partner for a very long time. That's very much unlike the Constellation Biyao Alliance, which spread out with numerous groups, covering a large area, Druid supplemented. According to the new map, he now has several new outposts in the region, but their placement is odd. They're placed very far from the boundaries of a bronze-grade village, the scout said. The gazes of the 4 Libra heirs sharpened all at once, causing the scout to go quite pale. How far? It should be 420 kilometers from his village? The 4 Libra heirs all stood. As Lionel has said previously, the details of the upgrades available at the silver grade were kept in the dark. As such, there wasn't enough information to conclude that Lionel had a silver grade village which he had expanded the territory of twice over to 400 kilometers. Given that his upgraded outposts each had a radial range of 20 kilometers, that would explain the extra 20. However, even though they couldn't deduce this, they all knew that Lionel wasn't a fool despite how disdainful they had been of his threats. There seemed to be only 2 explanations for this. The first was that Lionel had received a rare reward that allowed him to extend the territory range of his village. As such, he placed his outposts a large distance away relying on this. The second explanation was that Lionel was using outposts in place of his scouts, using them to alert him of movement much earlier on. However, this second method felt quite foolish. The price-to-reward ratio wasn't worth it. The number of outposts that would be necessary was excessive. It would cost millions at the very least. How many outposts are there? There aren't many, less than a dozen. The 4 heirs frowned in confusion. Even just to cover a circumference of 420 kilometers, you would need at least 260 bronze-grade outposts with 10-kilometer ranges. Even if you doubled that, the price was eye-watering. What was the point of so few outposts? Show us the locations of these outposts. The scout hurriedly brought forward a crude map that seemed to update in real time. It was less accurate to say that the map was crude, and it was instead just not very detailed. Even so, there were many important points on it. Juan's pupils were the first to constrict. This configuration. They're all strategic points, Druid said with narrowed eyes. Herace the closest water source. Herace a choke point. Every time Druid pointed, it would elucidate another important point. When she finished, they all looked up. It was impossible for someone who hadn't had any scouts to have such a good understanding of the overall situation. The only explanation left was that Lionel's territory had a range of at least 400 kilometers. Not only that, but after he had claimed Nazag's territory, he had somehow gotten it to 400 kilometers of range first as well. If this was true, Lionel didn't have a vague outline of the day side. He had a near-perfect map of what amounted to at least 20% of the day side, a map that was far more valuable than their vague outlines of 100% of it. Chapter 1952. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:07 p.m. Chapter 1952. Trump card versus trump card. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The gap isn't that big. What's most important is terrain, dungeons and challenges. We have a strong grasp of all of those. We have a strong grasp of terrain and challenges, as well as villages, but dungeons are more difficult. They're often hidden and don't have any obvious markers. We can only make educated guesses. In terms of range, we have the upper hand. But in terms of details and dungeons specifically, we're definitely on the losing end. The situation wasn't as bad as they thought. Although they didn't know how Lionel had gotten so much range, there was still a large buffer between them and him. In addition, they had their own preparations. But look here, Nazag's territory is gone. That means he's moved it. But why? He's planning on using the fusion method. He used the territory map of Nazag's village first, memorized it, then took it with him. Remember, Lionel Morales is the youngest of us all. He lost 20 years, and he is also the littlest Nova. He's been behind from the very beginning. He knows this more than anyone. So his goal is to focus on just a single territory. This is good for us. We'll always know where he is. It'll be much easier to monitor him. I suggest we assign a team to him. With the shorter range, the maps will be much more detailed and we'll be able to pay attention to everything he does and respond accordingly. Agreed, but we need some other measures as well. Fifth Nova is expanding quickly and he's our most immediate enemy. We can't divert too much attention to a fire so far away and end up burned on this side. That much is easy. We failed to use the Constellation Biyao alliance, however I think we'll have to stop holding back. Our advantages aren't as large as we would like, especially with these variables. Let's release a few more trump cards. Already? The best faction to use given the situation is the Leo family, but a Constellation family isn't so easy to make use of even if their leader is a bit dense. This is the best choice. The four looked toward one another and nodded. This was a trump card they only wanted to use during the end game. Using it now would expose their tracks ahead of time and make it less effective in the future, but sometimes part of a powerful trump card was knowing when to use it, and waiting until the last moment wasn't always the ideal moment. As the Libra were scheming, Lionel had already been taking his own steps. They were very much correct about the fact that he had taken advantage of succeeding in the upgrade challenge to map out another 400 kilometers. The price was steep, but he valued information overall. What he needed most was the location of his next target, and he had found it. But first, he used the almost 1,000 kill exchanges he had gained from the Constellation Biyao alliance, and that over 10,000 he had gained from another successful silver grade challenge, to call forward more subordinates. The first group Lionel called forward was the Umbra family. In fact, he had called them forward even before beginning the challenge because he had been waiting precisely for nightfall. Lionel nodded toward Radlease and nodded. You have the night. By the end of it, I want to know everything about this supercontinent. Ignore all challenges, mark down the location any dungeons, and want a systematic report of every air and territory in this region. Yes. Radlease nodded. In a flash, he and hundreds of Umbra family members melded into the night. It was as though they had never been there at all, fusing into the shadows like phantoms. In the depths of the night, they were truly at home. Back when the Umbra family attacked Earth, they were able to vanish from sight even in the middle of the day. However, Lionel had still waited for night to set them loose. There were multiple reasons for this, but the main reason was efficiency. The strength of the Umbra family was several times more powerful in the night, and they could, as such, finish their tasks much faster. It wasn't worth it to trade for them earlier than now as they weren't able to display their true strength for fear of exposing their family's ties to the three-finger cult. As such, much like he had done with everything else, Lionel only revealed his cards at the absolute perfect time. After this, Lionel waved a hand and dozens appeared before him. To the absolute astonishment of those watching from the outside, every single one of them was a member of the Cloud race. However, they were all in chains. Lionel had long since bound their wills to him, with a thought: he could kill them. So long as they refused to follow his orders, their death was inevitable. Of course, Lionel had done all of this long ago. He wouldn't waste precious time here torturing and convincing. Lionel waved a hand and removed their chains. He flipped a palm, revealing a communication device. His gaze flickered through it as he read with great speed. This information was none other than what Emna and James had already sent back to him after their half-day's effort. Within it, there were a few territories already marked. Of course, Lionel couldn't rely on the information given by just two people, especially since their original job was only to clear as many challenges and dungeons as possible. Information was secondary. This was why he had sent out the Umbra family as well. That said, this advanced information, as crude as it was good enough to send out a few teams of Cloud Race members. You few will go here. As for you, here. Lionel quickly assigned them. Without many words, the Cloud Race dispersed. After activating their race's movement technique, they were like wisps of silvery gray in the night, fast and imperceptible. Chapter 1953. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1953. Most neglected. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's asks of them weren't as detailed as he would like, but the rest would have to wait until the Umbra family returned. For now, this would have to do. They would know to infiltrate to the highest level of management they could. Although it didn't feel like it, there were, quite literally, hundreds of heirs participating. With the sheer number of families there were, and how many had completely disregarded his words, this number was actually on the lower end. However, the moon was small, only about half to three-quarters the size of Earth. Of course, a few thousand people versus a moon of this size still made looking for people like looking for a needle in a haystack. As such, Lionel knew he didn't just need to care for the bigwigs, he also needed to find and crush the smaller players before they could get a foothold. The reason for this was obvious. As he improved his lead, he would eventually become a threat, and because of his abrasive words, he would become a target, not that he wasn't already a target to begin with. Even if Lionel was nothing more than a smiling face and spread nothing but niceties, they would still want to deal with him. In that case, Lionel had an obvious ticking time bomb strapped to his ankle, and that was the obvious ending where he was swarmed from all sides. He had a numbers problem to face to begin with. If he had to face so many at once, it would be hard to come out victorious. In that case, Lionel needed to start placing certain countermeasures in place now. The outposts were only the beginning. He would begin systematically grinding away at all of these enemies one by one. The Umbra would deal with any small groups they ran into that could be casually dealt with. They were a family of assassins after all. This first group of Cloud Race would infiltrate the few that could be considered to be at a middle range and destroy them from the inside out. Once the Umbra returned with a full detailed report, he would send out another group of Cloud Race with the purpose of targeting the largest groups and waiting for the opportune moment to crush them. Lionel finished assigning the Cloud Race swiftly. He turned toward the Oryx. Return to the village, enter the segmented cubes pods and rest. There are 1,000 total pods. Take turns. After each group finishes, head to the north, east, west, south and their in-between cardinal directions respectively. The remaining 2,000 of you will stay to guard the village. With the segmented cube, Lionel had a measure to deal with the fatigue pushed onto them by the environment. 15 minutes in the pod was worth a day of rest, but by the time they came out, they would be in pristine condition. Although he only had 1,000 of them, or more accurately could only spare the energy to use 1,000 at a time, it would only take 2 hours and a half for all 10,000 of the Oryx to be rejuvenated to their full strength. As for the first 8 groups, I will leave it to your commanders to decide when to retreat and when to advance. Do not die needless deaths. Leave it to me, Elther said boldly. Lionel nodded and sent them away. Then, he used the remaining more than 10,000 kill exchanges he had gained from the second silver grade upgrade challenge and summoned a large army of Sky's family members. If the number of Lionel's subordinates were to be counted, the largest number without a doubt came from the Sky's family. But as a family that wasn't necessarily the strongest, they obviously didn't have too many 7th dimensional experts younger than 100 years old. Even so, for a family of that scale, while producing 10,000 such individuals who had entered with the God path was impossible, they had more than enough of such individuals who had done so with the conventional path, and that was all Lionel needed. This was yet another loophole to take advantage of. While it was true that fatigue worked more luck it would for third-dimensional existences in this world, that was only after they stepped foot into this world. This meant that from the moment they were summoned, a subordinate would have a fresh pair of legs and eyes. A fresh pair of legs and eyes perfect for war. Lionel soared into the skies. Although he could feel the fatigue settling in already, his gaze was still cold and sharp. Before daybreak, he would claim his third silver-grade territory. Tomorrow, the Air Wars would introduce its first gold-grade territory. As Lionel marched, a group of individuals quickly caught up. With the village soon to be protected by the Oryx, Lionel's brothers had already caught up. Lionel wasn't taking any chances on this. He would kill two birds with one stone on this expedition. Not only would he claim his third territory, he would take down his second constellation family. The Tor family and Armand had entered his line of sight. He would conveniently deal with a small grudge at the same time. In an unknown corner of the Air Wars moon, a familiar trio had gathered. They stood by the ocean that separated the two supercontinents, cold air blowing by. They seemed close to one of the poles, but the water didn't seem intent on freezing over. Despite the fact it was clearly salted, it moved like a rushing river. These three were none other than Auric, Richard, and Montero. This will be the most neglected region of the Air Wars, but I believe the ancestor of Morales will be quite thorough. If we claim the seas before anyone else, anyone who wants victory will have to come through us, Auric said lightly. That sounds nice, Montero said somewhat skeptically, but the question is how. We won't be the only ones, the Pisk and Quarius families will definitely have the same idea. Also, one of them is tied to the first nova as well. Hearing this, Auric's smile only widened. Chapter 1954. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 58 seconds p.m. Chapter 1954. Never stop if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1954. Never stop, stop being mysterious. This is serious, Montero pressed. However, to Montero's surprise, rather than explaining, Auric looked toward Richard. Richard stepped to the edge of the rushing tide, his expression unreadable as he looked forward. It was difficult to tell what he was thinking, but he suddenly began to speak a moment later. Many people think that the Viola family's lineage factor is just related to heaviness. Our violet force is indeed quite heavy to everyone but us. It allows us to use less effort to explode with a great amount of strength. The more of our violet force we use, the greater the difference between our effort output and the strength resulting from it. However, this isn't the true secret of the Viola family. Do you know how old they'll be this year? Montero frowned. They had all been checked before entering. They should all be less than 100 years old. Beneath 100 years old, one's age didn't really matter very much unless you were still stuck at a low-dimensional tier. But Richard obviously didn't have this problem. Richard shook his head. I'm already almost 1,000 years old. It took me a lot of effort to reach this point. I was still in tier 9 of the 5th dimension when I was into my 70s. How could make it to the 7th dimension before I turned 100 years old? In fact, with my talent, it probably should have been impossible to ever take that step. Montero's frown deepened. What was Richard trying to get at? And why was he saying all of this? The true ability of violet force isn't heaviness. The description is much simpler, but far more profound. It can be summarized in just a single line: increasing output. Whatever you give, you will always receive more in. The true ability of violet force isn't heaviness. The description is much simpler, but far more profound. It can be summarized in just a single line: increasing output. Whatever you give, you will always receive more in return for. If I want to run at 10 miles an hour, my violet force will allow me to run at 12 with no added effort. If I swing to 100 pounds of force, my violet force will produce a swing of 150 pounds with no added effort on my part. If I exchange dozens of years of life, they'll receive the equivalent of hundreds of years of training results. Montero's heart skipped a beat. If what Richard was saying was true, how could anyone ever defeat the Viola family? Just what kind of force was this violet force, and why was it that he had never heard anything about it before? And with such a force backing them, why was the Viola family so weak? No, even more importantly than that, why was Richard so weak? Richard wasn't even comparable to the geniuses of the Cataclysm generation who had stepped into the seventh dimension, but the way he spoke about his lineage factor, it would be hard to say that any lineage factor in all of existence could be said to be better. He was quite vague with his numbers and there didn't seem to be any consistency between them, but even if he only gained the smaller 20% boost he mentioned first, that was game-changing. A 20% change in strength, especially in the seventh dimension, was huge. Nothing seemed to make sense about this. I understand all your questions already. Why are we so weak? Why am I so weak? Why was my family destroyed not just once, but twice? It's quite pathetic when you think about it. Richard looked toward Montero. If I gave you access to a powerful force right now, how well would you be able to use it? Take what you have the highest affinity in right now and imagine I gave you the number one force in that category, what would you be able to do with it? Montero's creased brows slowly loosened. Indeed, he wouldn't be able to do much with it at all. Just because you had high fire affinity, didn't mean Scarlet Star Force would listen to you. In fact, it might try to kill you instead. Lionel had the highest Scarlet Star Force affinity a person could possibly have and it was still trying to kill him. Richard looked away. Sometimes I think that some god was playing games with our family, rather than a blessing. This lineage factor has been more like a curse. Every step is labor-intensive. Whenever I have a small breakthrough and sense an increase in my life, I have no choice but to gamble it away in hopes that I can take another. That's how I've made it here to this point. If not for becoming trapped in that zone for those years, I would have never made the breakthroughs I had to finally reach this point and gain what small understanding of this force that I have. Even Lionel could have never guessed that this was the reason Richard looked far older than he should have. Richard had only lived less than 100 years, but the amount of years he had exchanged just to reach this point made him far older than that. He counted his age not in how much time passed, but in how many years he had lost. His every day was consumed by thoughts of revenge, of avenging his fallen family, of finally reaching the point where he could raise their legacy to the place his ancestors and all those who had died had hoped and wished for every day. The price was heavy, but he didn't plan to stop. He would never stop. These air wars were the perfect opportunity. If they could win, not only would they be able to get revenge on Lionel, but they would also be able to partake in the rewards the various families and organizations had pooled together. If they could take first place, then the losses his family had suffered would be returned 100-fold, and when the time came, the Viola family would rise to the height it was always meant to be at. He had started from zero before, he would just have to do it again. Chapter 1955. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 40 seconds p.m. Chapter 1955. Demand if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1955 Demand. Then what is your plan? Montero calmed his heart. He realized that things were spinning out of his control, and he didn't like it very much. But what allowed him to maintain his composure was the fact that although Richard had such hidden means, and Orinik was somehow privy to it all, was the fact that neither one of them felt outside of his ability to control. Of course, the three of them were allies, but such alliances only worked when all three had something equal to contribute. If that balance ever changed, it would quickly slip into a master-servant relationship. He couldn't allow his Aemon family to fall into such a situation after they had finally shed the label of six-dimensional family. At the same time, Montero needed to make sure that his inner thoughts didn't leak out. There was no need to strain the current relationship needlessly. One of the discoveries I've made is the fact that my violet force isn't just useful on myself and only myself. If I extend it to others, I can trigger sacrifices within them to force changes. Of course, such parties have to be willing or far weaker than me, but this has some interesting applications, especially when you learn to hone on the exchange point. Using my body as a medium, I can force exchanges even between one or more creatures. When I learned this, my progress became faster as I didn't have to experiment on myself any longer. I could master control of my force in lesser creatures and only use tried and tested methods on myself. Richard bent forward and placed a palm of the dark waters. In the depths of the night, it looked quite black, its depths remaining completely unknown. In the rain galaxy, there's a very special race of beasts known as the rain beasts. They're exceptionally weak, so much so that they're usually kept as domestic pets. From afar, they look like little puffs of blue clouds. They have no faces, no limbs, and are basically just spherical furballs. They're usually quite hard to find. They like to rest at the bottom of freshwater sources where they can get quite large. Their existence didn't become well known until they started clogging up some important waterways of populated planets. At first they were just directly killed, but this approach led to large floods. It turns out that the rain beasts are very good at absorbing water, it just takes them a long time. A very long time. However, when you kill them, they release it all at once, and water, though a seemingly benign creation, can be exceptionally dangerous at the right pressures, in the right quantities. A rain beast that only absorbs a small amount of water is a cute house pet that can be used to stay cool on a warm day or water your plants conveniently. A rain beast that absorbs a large amount of water is a natural disaster. As they are now, rain beasts aren't very useful to use. But after I'm done with them. Richard retracted his hand, looking up and asking a question he already knew the answer to. How many points will it take to trade for one rain beast? They're not even considered bronze grade, Orinik said with a laugh. Trading for a prepared resources always costs 10 times less than gaining it here. Killing an air-grade threat would provide 100,000 points here, so it only costs 10,000 points to trade for a prepared air-grade treasure. A sub-grade threat provides 10 points. A subgrade treasure exchange. Just 1 point. How many rain beasts do we have? Orinik's smile grew wider. More than we can use. Richard's, Orinik's, and Montero's gazes all burned frighteningly bright as they looked toward the ocean. Indeed, they could make these seas theirs. And the irony of it all? Richard wouldn't even have these beasts if not for Lionel forcing him to attack the rain galaxy back then in his scheme. Originally, Richard had gathered as many as he could, prepared to counter the chaotic water sector he believed had betrayed him, and now they would lead to Lionel's downfall. To Richard, he felt that this was all too poetic. The conversation of these three went completely unnoticed. With all the excitement going on, not a single soul cared to pay attention to three relative unknowns. The heirs of the human domain's strongest families were fighting it out. How could they have time to care about three families that had only recently entered the seventh dimension? It also didn't help that it felt like every one of Lionel's actions was taking the attention of the elders by storm. The choice to challenge the silver grade immediately once again, especially right after the Oryx had fought such a large battle, was baffling. Many couldn't help but comment on the fact that he was pushing his men too far. It would only be a matter of time before they collapsed. But before this thought could even be properly formed, the sleeping pods of the segmented cube left them in complete and utter silence. After 15 minutes, the Oryx exited as though they had rested for weeks, their auras as towering and powerful as when they first began their march. Many didn't get much time to spend being surprised about this, because the appearance of the Umbra family left those of Shield Cross Stars watching with narrowed gazes. Cross Elder Avon, who was also in attendance, couldn't help but watch with a frown. He had never seen such perfect assassin's techniques, even with his eyes. He couldn't quite keep up with their movements, and after they scattered, because none of them were heirs, there was no easy method of finding them again. Just where had Lionel gotten such a force? But in very Lionel fashion, even this shock didn't have much time to settle down before Cross Elder Avon and many others stood to their feet, their eyes widened in shock. 1. 2. 12. 24. 100. Cross Elder Avon stopped counting, it no longer seemed to matter. He slapped his palm down, his rage echoing through the silence. Shield Cross Stars demands an explanation. Where did so many cloud rays come from? Chapter 1956. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1956. Single 1. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1956. Single 1. From the beginning, Cross Elder Avon had been silent. He was supposed to be a neutral party, and though he had a belly full of both doubt and fury revolving around the matters of Earth, he had suppressed it. For the same reason he had to retreat from Earth's territory, maintaining the facade of neutrality Shield Cross Stars had, he also had to maintain proper decorum here. However, the moment he gained a chance to apply pressure, the suppressed fury and doubt erupted forth and he questioned the Morales loudly. By this point, Ancestor Alvaro's patience was wearing thin. It felt like an hour couldn't pass by without another jumping clown trying to apply pressure on his Morales family. When did they become an easy target seemingly anyone could step onto? Of course, Alvaro was exaggerating by no small amount. Whether it was Ancestor Goldark, Ancestor Mito of the constellation Bao Alliance, or Cross Elder Avon, not only were they all eighth-dimensional monsters, each one of them was the leader of a powerhouse faction of great strength. While they weren't seen to be on the same level as the Morales family, they also couldn't be easily ignored, and this was especially so for Shield Cross Stars. Even so, Ancestor Alvaro didn't seem to give a damn. "What kind of tone are you trying to use with me?" he practically growled. Avon's temper was no less fiery. When he heard these words, he reacted like a tiger who had just gotten its tail stepped on. Fire quite literally blazed in his eyes and the surrounding metal of his flagship began to turn red. Just earlier, when Lionel had arrived with their stolen flagship and descended to the air wars, he had already been stifling his words and actions. But now it seemed the Morales didn't care about poking the bear. "Do you think the likes of you are capable of policing my tone? Do you think I want sanction the whole Morales family for colluding with the Cloud race? Last I checked, Cloud race scum were gallivanting amidst your ranks. Didn't see any of them in chains until Littlest Nova exposed them. Does Shield Cross Stars have the right to sanction anyone?" Cross Elder Avon had been ready for a spar of words, but his next volley was immediately cut off by these words. He felt stifled, so much so that his face turned beet red and his mustache bristled beneath his heaving breaths. However, unfortunately for him, the Morales weren't finished. Littlest Nova had to register all of these Cloud race people before they were allowed to be used. "Do you think we don't know where they came from? They were all in Earth's territory. Shield Cross Stars was present all the while, and yet it wasn't until you were kicked out that they were exposed. Police force of the human domain? What a joke, you can't even do your jobs as well as a junior." Avon's chest heaved. "So you expect me to believe that just because you say so? Just like you wanted the human domain to believe that an heir of the Morales was a Tier 1 fugitive just because you said so. I still haven't sought an account about that matter, how dare you? You think I'm afraid of you? Come seek your account." The bluster and billowing of the two old men made the starry skies quake. If not for the fact that most other families and organizations had sent their ancestors as well, the surrounding flagships would have already been blown to bits by this point. However, that was all the bluster and billowing. Alvaro seemed to be daring Avon to do something more than just talk, but Avon seemed to be doing the same thing. Shield Cross Stars still needed to maintain their neutrality, while Alvaro had already won their spar of words. By this point, Avon's responses were nothing more than the whining of a baby. The two barked back and forth, but quite quickly, their argument had no choice but to come to a pause as Lionel's army had already appeared in Armand Taurus territory. In that moment, the Tor constellation family gripped their fists. Lionel was truly ruthless. In the dead of night, he marched. By this point, the fatigue of the first batch of enterers was already setting in. For Lionel, it was no different. If there was any advantage he had, it was that his dream force was especially dense, so it took quite a lot to fatigue his mind, and his vitality was especially great, making it quite difficult to fatigue his body. Even so, he was reaching the end of his limits as well. He had used his mind to an extreme today, pushing his calculation abilities to the limit to ensure that every step was as perfect as possible. As for his body, it was in relatively better condition. However, he knew he had to do this. The Tor family was performing well, although not as well as the leaders. They had claimed a village that was currently still at the subgrade. However, other than this, their approach was a bit unique due to their size, or more accurately, the village had adjusted due to this. The Tor family was a family of giant-like humans. For them, being 2 meters tall was considered short, and most would be taller than 3 meters tall by the time they reached the 7th dimension. For the sake of fairness, the walls of the Tor family wouldn't possibly be the same size as that of other families. They would naturally build their structures much taller. As such, the Tor family had gained an advantage only similar giant families gained. After claiming their territory, the height of the walls doubled, as did their thickness. While they were still marginally weaker than the bronze grade, it wasn't by a large amount. As such, the Tor family wasn't obsessed with upgrades just yet and focused on using their territory map to quickly find and clear challenges and dungeons. Thanks to this approach, they not only had villages with defenses comparable to the bronze grade, they had 2 of them in relatively close distance. Even so, Lionel didn't split his forces, he charged on just a single one. Chapter 1957. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 1957. Blazing battle intent. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1957. Blazing battle intent. Lionel sat in silence for a long while. He took deep breaths as 3 silver stars appeared to his back. They rotated slowly, large amounts of dream force seeping into his body. The recovery of his mind was especially so, but it was just enough. His eyes snapped open and he jumped, fluttering down from the skies amidst the stars. Attack! The appearance of Lionel and the others had already been noted, but far too late for the Tor to make large, advanced preparations. Among those that were still awake, many were simply scouts. As this was the first day and their nerves were sharp, they were relatively quick to react. But the range of a subgrade village was too short and not everyone had the capital to spend on outposts like Lionel. At best, their warning was just enough for the Tor that were resting to jump from their beds, rushing forward in preparation for battle. Unsurprisingly, Armand was among them. With every step he took, the ground quaked, a twin pair of battle axes crossed on his back. He stood at just over 4 meters tall and his muscles rippled like steel cords beneath his tough skin. The veins that protruded along his body were vibrant and a colorful bluish-purple with just the tiniest hints of golden flakes. One could almost see the blood rushing like tides within them, but one could most definitely hear the tsunami-like crashing waves that urged forward with his every movement. For such a tall person to appear in the human race, their entire physiology had to be properly changed. His bones were like steel pipes, his heart was like a rumbling engine, his nerves fired with great speed, his muscles were thick and powerful. When Lionel saw this man, he remembered the first time he had seen him. Back then, his snowy star owl blood had been completely suppressed. Not used to such a feeling, he had lost in their exchange of gazes. In reality, it couldn't be considered a loss. Lionel had frowned out of annoyance and Armand had taken it as his victory, maybe rightfully so. It was probably also due to this that Lionel had made the decision to give up the convenience of having techniques to match with his lineage factor and abandon the snowy star owl entirely. Even so, Lionel wasn't the type of person who liked to suffer such a loss. Maybe even Armand had already forgotten about this matter, after all, so many things had happened since then and Lionel had already proven himself several times over. But as though he had a fishbone stuck in the back of his throat, he had never forgotten this. At that moment, Lionel surged forward, his army flooding forward with him like a tide of darkness in the night. But very quickly, they lit up the battlefield as though it was midday, sharp flashes of lightning echoing through the skies like ripples of sound waves. Lionel's 3 stars flickered and vanished, only to be replaced by 3 blue stars that were just as vibrant and shocking. His panda construct covered his body and his divine armor snapped into place. Bang! He landed before Armand, the ground quaking as he punched out with 6 fists. Armand's expression was not good at this moment. He realized that he was outnumbered in a ratio worse than 10 to 1, and now Lionel was appearing before him when he and the few behind him were the only ones capable of changing the situation. Although Lionel had great numbers, there were no great geniuses among them. Armand could easily face 100 of them or more at a time alone, and that was only assuming that the rest would try to fight other battles. If there were no other burdens, he was confident in fighting all 10,000 on his own and killing them all. However, if Lionel blocked him, "You four go forward. I will deal with him as quickly as possible, don't let our brothers die." Armand punched forward, expecting a strong fight, but the moment his fists connected with Lionel's, he frowned. Even when the other two pairs of fists landed on his torso, his frown only deepened. Too weak. Lionel's fists crackled and his forward momentum came to a stop. Even as the vital star force pumped through his veins, he was forced 2 steps back. If not for the protection of his divine armor, his panda construct would have definitely lost at least 2 arms, even his divine armor had hairline fractures on it. Although his divine armor was technically of the life grade, a grade that was noted to be the equivalent of the 8th dimension, it wasn't truly at this level. Lionel had simply comprehended a new state of crafting, allowing him to use lower dimensional materials to display strength of treasures far beyond. As such, when Lionel saw this, he wasn't surprised. Armand's gaze flashed, his expression turning ferocious as Lionel's 8 brothers and several other experts rushed forward to block his strongest backers. He could end his battle with Lionel quickly. In fact, he was a bit slow, now that he thought about it. As long as Lionel died or was forced to retreat, this victory would be theirs and they would gain over 10,000 kill exchanges on top of that. However, what Armand couldn't see was that Lionel's expression was absolutely calm. He could practically feel the excitement of the tour and other families watching, believing that he had overestimated himself. A smirk curled his lips. He had crushed Nazag because the latter was an expert of the Biyao and he was a Biyao sovereign. What chance did he stand? Armand, however, was not only a genius at Nazag's level, but he had no obvious weaknesses against Lionel. It could be said that this would be Lionel's first true test since stepping into the air wars. The gap between the 6th and 7th dimensions was indeed obscenely large. But he had only used his fists just now. Since when was he a fist expert? Lionel's aura flourished. Star fusion, combustion. The sapphire blue stars to Lionel's back suddenly blazed to life, becoming more akin to balls of fire than stars. At the same time, the vital star force rushing out from the joints and valves of his divine armor turned from royal blue to deep crimson as he grasped at the air, a large black rod appearing in his hands. "Show me why they call you all the Cataclysm generation. The last time I fought one of you, I was greatly disappointed." Lionel's battle intent blazed. Chapter 1958. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 1958. Aura: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1958. Aura: 2 giants stood across from one another, their auras blazing. Lionel's black spear pulsed with dense black fog, rising like a tide and forming a twin pair of menacing blades. At the same time, Armand pulled his twin axes from his back, the veins along his forearms pulsing. Lionel's force rippled with a dense crimson. Armand's skin seemed to redden, a white steam coming off of him as his heart seemed to rev up like an engine. The two moved at once. Bang! The ground cracked, rippling force spreading out in all directions. Despite their size, they moved like wisps of wind. For most, the only way to keep track of them was to follow the trail of white and red. The colors intertwined, connecting and separating, spinning around one another and separating, sending one flying, and then the other reciprocating. Armand's gaze sharpened and his blood continued to heat up. After the first exchange, whatever excitement he had had for this battle had waned. He had a poor habit of being lazy. He couldn't seem to get up to do things unless there was a great battle in store for him. Not only his actions, but his face seemed to reflect this. He cared too little about many things. However, after the second exchange, and the third, and the fourth, his eyes began to slowly redden. His muscles grew a size and a pair of horns began to slowly manifest from his head. It seemed that with every exchange, they would grow another inch, and with them, his strength would rise explosively. By the time they had grown to just over 2 feet, Lionel's combustion was being quickly suppressed. Even so, in that moment, the two of them suddenly laughed, a booming laughter that rumbled like thunder and struck like lightning. Bang! Lionel was sent reeling backward as Armand spread out his arms, his aura towering. The shimmering, but faint image of a creature loomed behind him. When it appeared, his body expanded by double its original size, his aura continuing to climb. On the outside, the Tor family elders sighed a breath of relief. In truth, they were quite helpless. Armand was the most talented junior to be born into their family in a very long time, maybe ever. But his laziness was a real problem. He should have been spoken about along with the likes of the Sword Deity and Bao Deity, but he couldn't be bothered. This state of his. This was the first time they had seen it in a very long time. They were surprised that it was Lionel who could bring this out of him, especially since, with their sharp eyes, they could tell that Lionel wasn't nearly enough to threaten him, at least not with the power he was using currently. However, Armand could sense something familiar from Lionel, a familiar sort of arrogance. It wasn't that Armand was lazy, it was rather that he didn't feel much was worth his effort. He wasn't interested in recognition, nor was he interested in accolades. His position in the Tor family had already stabilized the day he was born, so what was there to strive for? In fact, he was only participating in this battle because his elders had made him. But for some reason, he suddenly felt excited. Lionel clapped his second and third pair of hands together, causing a resonating shockwave to spread out in all directions. To his back, his 3 stars suddenly became 5, a pair of dark blue stars pairing with his 3 radiant bright blue stars. Armand swung both of his axes downward without the slightest hint of mercy in his eyes. A bloodlust leaked from his body. He seemed to have forgotten about everything, even his fellow family members. All he wanted was battle. The wind kicked up and Lionel's absolute spear domain suddenly manifested. However, it was decidedly different from usual. Rather than a simple radiant gold, it carried a dark blue heaviness to it. Armand found his twin axes slowing before he even made contact. Lionel's smile seemed to have vanished and all that was left was an abrupt coldness. What excitement and pleasure that had been on his face seemed to have been entirely suppressed. Star fusion, King's might. Lionel's aura erupted once again, the dense crimson becoming an even denser violet. It felt as though a king had descended, the spear crown on his panda construct's 3 heads growing in size and magnificence. His spear pierced forward, vanishing through the void. Armand's heart skipped a beat. He hurriedly reversed the flow of his force, something that would have shredded apart the body of almost anyone else, but he seemed to do it with ease, blocking with all his might. Bang! Armand stumbled a step back, but Lionel had already retracted his spear and pierced forward again. At the same time, the motion of his second and third pair of hands shifted, a large accumulation of void star force appearing in the skies like surging flood dragons that descended with a deathly momentum. Swift. 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 Lionel's spear seemed to have changed entirely, its magnificence on full display. It felt as though he had just been toying around before. His previous attempts had entirely lacked the same elegance, the same oppression. Forceful. Bang! Armand's block was nearly thrown back entirely, his back bending at an awkward angle. The excitement blazing in his eyes only seemed to be increasing. His muscles pulsed so quickly that they seemed to vibrate. He dug his heels in the ground, his horns turning red under the heat his body was giving off. Roar! Holding his axes, he punched out, meeting the twin flood dragons of void star force. He seemed to completely ignore Lionel's spear as it approached and pierced into his chest. Bang! He was sent flying backward, his body arcing as he oriented himself in the skies and landed heavily. Suddenly, his expression changed. Lionel's aura had changed once again. Before the eyes of everyone, the 2 dark blue stars began to quickly accumulate runes, its aura growing. Chapter 1959. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 1959. Emptiness. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1959. Emptiness. When Armand looked up, He could seem to see Lionel's gaze. Despite the armor, despite the panda construct, despite the rippling obstructions of force, he could still feel it. It was a gaze of dominance, a gaze that demanded submission, a gaze that wanted to crush the pride in his heart and force it into obedience. An absolute defense circulated around Lionel. An absolute offense graced the tip of his spear. And with a step, a flawless synergy seemed to be formed. The blade of his black spear grew and dwarfed Armin's blades in the blink of an eye. Kneel. It was just a single word, just a single syllable, just a single breath. However, the world seemed to change colors. When the tip of Lionel's spear appeared before him this time, Armand saw that it was bathed in a violet light as well. Sometimes, the essence of a spear technique didn't need a long phrase behind. Often an emotion didn't need a long explanation attached to it. Lionel's spear seemed to embody this, and it demanded surrender. The unwillingness bubbled up from deep with Armand, and his battle intent quickly turned to fury. Bang! At that moment, the shimmering image behind him solidified and grew with a towering majesty. The form of a golden minotaur stood. Its horns shimmered like two gems, its body looking as though it was carved of the most precious gems. All at once, the Tor ancestors rose to their feet, the excitement in their eyes practically boiling over. Armin's body grew yet another size, the veins coursing throughout his body pumping. In the past, there were only faint flecks of gold, but now, they radiated a dense golden energy as though liquid gold was coursing through his body. Armand roared and swung to meet Lionel's blade. Their weapons collided and the world fell into silence for just a moment before everything seemed to be unleashed all at once. The ground beneath and around them was blasted apart, a large crater spreading out. The air snapped and crackled, and the region for countless kilometers was lit up by colors of gold and violet. Lionel felt a powerful resistance, but so too did Armand. The faces of his panda construct and Armand were practically nose to nose. They leaned forward, even somewhat crossing over their own weapons as if they would rather headbutt than exchange blows with their blades. However, at that moment, Armand's blades gave way. Lionel's spear descended, slashing across his chest as though it was nothing more than wet paper. He severed flesh and bone as one, cutting into his lungs and heart. Armand collapsed to a knee, coughing up a mouthful of blood, and then another. The intent to battle was still blazing in his eyes, the golden idol to his back making that intent clear. But even with his usual healing factor, the wound refused to close. Lionel looked down toward the cracked battle axes in Armand's hands. They were excellent weapons, but unfortunately, they were only of the gold grade. After their first few exchanges, they had already shown signs of cracking and fracture. Although Armand had tried to protect them with his battle axe force, how could his weapon force be superior to Lionel's despite being in the seventh dimension? Lionel felt that it was a bit unfortunate. He could have stopped when he sensed Armand's axes giving way, or he could have used a weaker spear from the beginning, but he had refused to do so. These air wars weren't about his own selfish desires to do battle, his goal here was bigger. He was already indulging enough by fighting Armand alone and not teaming up with Aina to finish it quickly in the first place. He couldn't indulge any more than that. There was a moment of silence as Lionel met Armand's gaze. "Good battle," he said plainly. Armand looked up without a word. Even though he was on a knee, he barely had to, his increase in size having been enough that even while down, he was almost the height of Lionel's panda construct. At that moment, he could have crushed his badge and escaped, but seeing the slaughter of his clansmen around him, his eyes dimmed. For the first time, his battle intent waned somewhat. The tip of Lionel's spear trembled once and Armand's head was severed from his shoulders. The Tor family fell into silence. Veins popped across their forearms and foreheads, the heat in their surroundings rising as their bloodlines thumped. The sound of their hearts, especially as they resonated as one, felt like rumbling and collapsing earth. Unlike the others, they took deep breaths and didn't say a word, but the red in their eyes, their growing horns and the quaking of their flagship painted a completely different picture. The echo of Lionel's words seemed to descend once more. The words of a king couldn't be retracted, and exceptions couldn't be made for them. Others might have thought that Lionel might spare Armand for the sake of a good battle, or because he had never wanted to be there in the first place, or because he felt a sort of resonance with him. But Lionel had never had any intention of doing that. As many came as many as he would kill. He looked up into the skies as though he could see the gazes of those that must have been paying attention to him right this moment. His momentum was undying. If it wasn't obvious already, it was as clear as day now. He had come with the intention of fighting against the world. On just the first day, Lionel had killed not just one genius of the Cataclysm generation, but two of them. These geniuses that should have been fighting it out for the final, ultimate glory, were unceremoniously slaughtered with the human domain as witness. The words of Lionel Morales were never and would never be spoken with any sort of emptiness. Chapter 1960. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 1960. Interesting. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1960. Interesting. Every action Lionel took seemed to remind him of the words he had spoken back then. Every genius that fell caused another pang of regret to light their hearts, another surging pain and unwillingness coursing through their veins. It was at that moment that some began to realize that Lionel had done this on purpose. Every time he killed, they would be reminded of their words, reminded of what could have been, reminded that everything that was happening now was their fault. Whether they acknowledged that in the future and didn't blame Lionel himself was entirely unknown. However, what was certain was that they would know the truth in their hearts. Armand had never wanted to enter the air wars to begin with. It was they who had made him, they who had ignored his wishes. He could have been home right this moment, lounging as he normally did. But now he was lying in a pool of his own blood. Ruthless, too ruthless. Ancestor Goldark said coldly. This time, he didn't bother to seek an answer from the Morales family, he only said this to stoke the flames. His Goldark family wouldn't be the only one to suffer, and if there was an opportunity to retaliate, they also wouldn't be alone. However, when he glanced over at the Morales ancestor, all he saw was pride in their eyes and sneers on their lips. This group of madmen didn't seem to give a damn. Gather up, Lionel's voice called out as he lowered his gaze from the skies. Well, begin the silver grade upgrade now, yes. The Sky's family members took deep breaths, but they weren't nearly at the end of their ropes yet. They had had overwhelming numbers, and though they had to team up for victory, this had helped them to save quite a lot of energy as well. They were prepared. They reformed their teams and gathered up. With silver-grade threats on the horizon, they would once again have a tough challenge ahead of them, and this time Lionel didn't have any terrain changers to use to his advantage. Even so, their numbers, with the support of his brothers, him and Aina, should be enough. The upgrade challenge was triggered and the battle ensued. As expected, it was far more challenging than the first time around. The Sky's family members, at least the majority of them, were only about as strong as bronze-grade threats, as if they could fight such an existence one-on-one. Only about 10% of them were as good as a silver-grade threat. The Oryx were different in this regard, which was why they were such a surprise to the people of the human domain. This relatively unknown race of people were mostly silver-grade threats, with about 10% of them being gold-grade threats. This aside, given the circumstances, it was unsurprising that the challenge was tough. This time, it was Lionel and his group that was at a disadvantage in number. Not only were they disadvantaged in terms of numbers, but they were also weaker overall. If Lionel's earlier actions had seemed insane, this was even beyond just that. His eagerness to gather a third city to complete the fusion was excessive. This was especially so given the fact that if he was struggling so much with a silver-grade upgrade, there was absolutely no way he would be able to deal with the gold-grade upgrade challenge anyway. Not only would the numbers they faced in the gold-grade upgrade challenge be at least 100 times more than the around 10,000 of the silver-grade, because it was a fusion path he was taking, it would be 3 times more than even that. On top of that, they would all be gold-grade threats. By this logic, it made no sense for Lionel to be pushing the limits like this. He shouldn't be able to enter the gold grade anytime soon anyway. However, at that moment, Lionel took a deep breath and closed his eyes. When they opened again, the fatigue within them was clear, but the determination was even clearer. These next few steps would be the ultimate deciding factor. 3 silver stars appeared to Lionel's back once more and he roared into the skies. If one was standing to his back, it would be possible to see a silvery gold glow shimmering through the back of his neck. At that moment, one after another, countless troll beasts appeared in the skies, each valiantly wearing a coat of violet armor. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, then over 10,000. They had hardly settled down when Lionel's aura rose again. Roars echoed across the skies as one earth dragon after another began to appear, their enormous bodies blotting out the skies. They, too, looked exceptionally valiant, donning their own violet armor, their presences menacing as their hundreds of blade-like legs pierced down from the skies above. Lionel huffed and puffed, veins popping up across his forehead. At that moment, he used a kill exchange and summoned Little Blackstar. The little guy was only about 3 feet long, but he seemed to instantly become the center of the battlefield. "Crush them," Lionel said lightly. He threw everything he had forward. It was maybe only now that those watching understood that Lionel hadn't run out of trump cards just yet. In fact, the only new ability he had displayed just now was the summoning of a beast creature they had never seen before. The little mink looked unremarkable, but the moment he entered the fray, he didn't kill in batches any smaller than 10. Under the control of Lionel, silver-grade spirit constructs crashed against silver-grade beasts, monsters and trolls. The pressure against the Sky's family members was alleviated instantly. With Lionel's spirit constructs taking the front lines, their job couldn't have been easier. They looked for vulnerable creatures and killed them while they were occupied. Strikes of lightning spread across the battlefield and the battle soon came to an end. Lionel took deep breaths, his body seemingly reaching its limits as well. His mind couldn't help but wonder. This sort of feeling was created using nothing but dream force, that he was certain of. What was the secret behind it? And could he replicate it? Lionel claimed the city after spending millions to expand its region to 400 kilometers as well. His gaze flickered for a moment when he saw what the territory map had to offer. Interesting. Chapter 1961. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 1961. Fairy tale: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1961 Fairy tale. Lionel didn't move, standing in silence for a long while. His eyes were getting heavier, but he still pushed his mind to the absolute limit. After a moment, he waved a hand. This time, another wave of about 200 or so Cloud Race members appeared. Among them, there was even the former secretary Marquisette Maya. Maya looked up toward Lionel with a cold gaze, but she didn't say anything. Her 2 sons were in Lionel's hands, there really was nothing that she could do. While she had planned to enter the special calm-like state of the Cloud Race, under Lionel's threat, she couldn't do this. "You'll be him until I tell you otherwise," Lionel nudged ahead toward Armin's corpse. Maya took a glance and didn't say anything. But after a moment, her aura shifted and she grew to the point where she was almost an entire 2 meters taller than Lionel. At a glance, even with further inspection, she looked exactly like Armand without the slightest deviation in look or aura, even her demeanor had become similar to his. Lionel hadn't expected this sort of accuracy from a corpse. There was definitely something special about the Cloud Race's ability to replicate others, more special than he knew. Disregarding this matter for now, Lionel sent the Cloud Race members away. They came as Cloud Race individuals and left as giants of the human race. A plan brewed in Lionel's mind as he watched them leave. The moment he had noticed that the Tor family had not just 1, but 2 villages, another idea began to formulate in his mind. He shifted around some of his original plans and made some small adjustments. Maya would have originally been invaluable to clearing the coming gold grade upgrade challenge, but in her current spot, she was much more useful to him. Once this was done, Lionel claimed the now silver grade city, completing his trifecta. Now, it was time to return and rest. By this point, all 10,000 of the Oryx should have gotten the rest they needed. "Let's go." Lionel lit the region on fire. He wanted to give off the illusion that a great battle had been fought, but while the Tor lost 1 village, they managed to hold Lionel off and retreat to their second city. This displayed the strength Lionel wanted to give off while also making his trap easier to hop into. As of now, no one in the Air Wars knew that he had Cloud Race pawns on his side, and he would keep it that way for as long as possible. By the time his trap was sprung, he would be able to raise the day side to the ground and march toward the night side. Victory would be his. Although everyone saw Lionel's actions in impersonating the Tor family geniuses, there was nothing that they could do about it. Even the Morales family wasn't interfering with the event, and if they tried to secretly communicate, the first to notice would be Ancestor Hito. Everything was under their control and cheating at this point was impossible. It would all come down to what preparations their youths had made ahead of time. Even so, seeing Lionel using the Cloud Race in this way no doubt made the Tor family absolutely furious. All the while, an incomplete and even false impression of the events was relayed to the Libra family heirs. Their grasp of the situation was limited to begin with. They could only see the aftermath of the event and conclude exactly what Lionel wanted them to conclude. Upon returning to the village, Lionel entered a pod. When he stepped out just 15 minutes later, those watching were surprised, but they had already seen the Oryx do this. They could only watch with ugly expressions as Lionel gained another huge advantage. Recall the troops marching in this direction, both of them. The messages were sent out swiftly and they began their return. Lionel didn't want the troops he had sent out initially to interfere with the new Tor family. After all, if there was a troop in that area that the Tor, for some reason, didn't touch, it would be exposed as an oddity almost immediately. It was best that he regroup and reassign them. After Lionel sent out these orders, he gathered Aina and his brothers along with Raylion, Sail and the others as the Skies family took their turns in the pods. He marked out locations on the map and sent them out. Their targets were the dungeons that had used their now 3 territories to memorize the locations of. With the fact he had upgraded 3 regions to the silver grade now, they had not only spawned many more challenges, but many more dungeons as well, increasing the frequency of silver grade rewards. After sending them away, Lionel used yet another kill exchange to bring out little Tolly. By this point, everyone seemed to have realized that Lionel was running out of subordinates. Right this moment, he had thousands of kill exchanges, and yet he didn't use them. Instead, he converted them all into points after bringing out Noah and some other geniuses of Earth. Even when it came to the Cloud Race he had sent to impersonate the Tor family, he only sent them the 500 points they needed to upgrade to the bronze grade, then left them to their own devices. As for the now over 11 million points he had now, they seemed to sit idle, burning a hole in his pocket. However, Lionel didn't seem to notice. One by one, he took out the items the segmented cube had spent the day completing. After handing the Skies family their weapons and armors, he moved one to take out large bundles of what seemed to be simple plates without the slightest hint of engravings. Lionel's 3 stars appeared to his back, runes dancing across its surface as he leapt past his village walls, appearing in the depths of the mountain range that now surrounded them. He lifted his hands and controlled little Tolly with one hand. In the other, he held a life-grade force crafting quill that could only be described as gorgeous. Although it was formed with an ink-blank feather, every time Lionel's wrist flickered and it trembled, golden dust would sparkle down from its body, making it look as though it had come out of a fairy tale. Chapter 1962. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 1962. The Ocean. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1962. The Ocean. None had ever seen Lionel force craft before. He had left everything to the segmented cube until this moment. From the beginning, most had assumed that Fifth Nova was the most talented crafter of them all and that Lionel was probably the most talented in combat. Most didn't understand the intricacies of the divine armor technique and as such couldn't make accurate deductions about them. Only the Morales family understood for certain that it must have been Lionel who created his life-grade armor. For others, it was easier to assume that there must be a different sort of explanation. However, no one had expected Lionel to go from a path of murder to one of crafting supremacy. His demeanor seemed entirely the same, and yet his actions couldn't have been any different. It felt like his quill had become a spear, carving out everything in its path and crushing all it came across. Lionel's drawn force arts could only be said to be perfect. His finger designation left afterimages in the air as his hands danced across the skies. Lionel tossed a plain plate of silver metal into the air. Little Tolly snaked forward, enveloping it as Lionel's fingers tapped at the air. The crushing sound of the sound barrier shattering again and again resounded as Lionel's fingers only seemed to become faster and faster. Little Tolly responded in kind, the plate of metal becoming long and wire-wide before folding over itself and stretching out again. With his other hand, Lionel's force arts appeared one after another. They danced in the wind like fluttering butterflies. Each had their own unique expression, breathing life into the surroundings. The weathered grass beneath his feet became more vibrant and the wind smelled sweeter. In the end, a long, curved bar appeared and the force arts shot forward, embedding themselves and sinking into the metal rod as though they had always been one. With a thought, Lionel planted the curved rod into the ground, perfectly connecting it with the one he had finished last. As he moved across the exterior of his village, moving up and down the mountainous region and even diving into the long rivers he had created with the irrigation reward, a picture slowly began to form in the heads of those watching. Lionel was setting up a formation. Not only was he setting up a formation, but he was setting it up alone and without even the slightest deviation in error. By the time he was finished, the sun had begun to appear over the horizon as dawn presented itself to the world. As Lionel set down the last bar, a ripple spread out in all directions. The formation solidified just as the Umbra family began to return one after another. Lionel listened to their reports one by one, building up a solid understanding of the day side of the formation. However, there was something that he was quite interested in, so he looked toward Radley's for an explanation. No one seems to have stepped foot into the water on the surface. There are no signs of any waterfront villages being claimed, even the water force prominent families are taking their time. Lionel's gaze narrowed. The water was difficult to deal with, it was hard to tell what might be down there. Lionel had thought about expanding in that way specifically because it was difficult, but he changed his mind in the end, it wasn't worth it. The effort it would take didn't end up being worthwhile according to his simulations. However, Lionel knew that there would be others who had similar thoughts. Controlling the waterways might become a huge pitfall in the future. In that case, that means there are only small groups dealing in the waters currently. I also assume that the Pisk and Quarius families are expanding in that direction. Radley's nodded. Yes. Although they didn't start there, they are definitely making a move toward it. It also seems that they've sent small groups, just like you've said. However, their targets are clearing the challenges and dungeons no one else can reach. Lionel nodded. The air wars were meant to reflect the challenges in the real world. One only needed to look toward Earth to understand how difficult it was for fledgling worlds to deal with oceanic creatures and territories. If Earth hadn't terraformed and built a supercontinent, their trouble after the metamorphosis would have been countless times worse. Now, that trouble was being reflected here. One might wonder why the ocean was so much more trouble than land, and there were multiple reasons. The first was the obvious fact: humans couldn't breathe in water. Although force could replace it for a time, that wouldn't be indefinite. It also didn't help that the density of water force in the ocean meant that it was practically the only force available to absorb, and you would need special affinity with water force to separate out the forces you wanted from its special brand of neutral force. The second was the vastness and the relative secrecy. It was far too large and there were too many secret corners and crevices. Even Emperor Fox hadn't managed to find an easy way to deal with the ocean. The third was strength. Creatures that could withstand the water pressure of the ocean, especially after the metamorphosis, were all bound to be exceptional. There was no great change in gravity in the beginning, and any changes were slight and gradual. However, such slight changes could result in exponential changes in water pressure in the deepest reaches of the ocean. In addition, there was another glaring issue that fit into this third category: invalids. Emperor Fox had wiped almost all invalids in a single move, invalids on the surface, that is. Falling Paradise Islands might have caused devastating effects on the land, but in the ocean, given its depth, there was only so much their falls could have done. This made the ocean a prime location for the fostering of beast invalids, and more shockingly than that, beast variant invalids. It was unknown whether or not ancestor Hito would actually use invalids. It was doubtful. But he would make the difficulty of the ocean reflect real life, that much was certain. Lionel knew this, and as such, it was on his list of things to monitor despite the difficulty in doing so. Author's note: bad news looms over the horizon. Potentially just 2 chapters today. As always, will do my best to get no 3 out. Chapter 1963. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1963. Too late if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1963. Too late. There was nothing much that could be done about the ocean for now. The only method forward was patience and prudence. That said, when it came to the other tidbits of information that he could do something about, Lionel summons another wave of Cloud Race members. This time, his orders were hyper-specific and targeted. In fact, they felt even more detailed than even the information the Umbra family had given him. Radlease, however, was slowly getting used to working with Lionel. He understood that this man was one who didn't like to explain things. In all likelihood, he had already had an idea of what he wanted to do even before sending the Cloud Race members out. Go and rest. After you've recovered, you and the others will head to the other supercontinent. Ignore the ocean for now, but note anything out of the ordinary. Lionel said, before looking up. It's about time. With the sun rising on this side, it could be night on the opposing side of the moon now. This was the perfect time for the Umbra family to take action. Even if Lionel was on this half, he had no intention of neglecting the other. He had eyes on complete supremacy. While it was true that his performance until now was already enough to justify his arrogance and boldness, giving the Morales family quite a bit of momentum, he wasn't nearly satisfied enough. As he had said, this was nothing more than the precursor. Lionel's figure flickered, appearing in the core region of the village. His gaze was sharp and his heart calm. The fatigue was already beginning to accumulate between his brows once again, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it had been previously. It seemed that he almost took crafting as a time of leisure rather than an intrusively difficult activity. Many had begun to pay attention to other things while Lionel was crafting the formation. There were too few who understood force crafting truly. It was only those of the Omen family and the Morales family who couldn't take their eyes away, but even then, their relative reactions were far different. A deep frown marred Ancestor Radrian's brows. The skill that Lionel was displaying didn't make any sense to him. The precision, the meticulousness, even the faint inklings he had grasped toward his potential intentions, they all didn't seem to be something a junior of the 6th dimension should have been capable of. He would just barely be able to accept it if Lionel was the same age as the others, but if his information was correct, Lionel wasn't even 30 years old yet. In fact, he was quite a number of years from that age. How could he do this? As for the Morales family, they saw things on an even deeper layer. One would have thought that Lionel had allowed the segmented to only forge the more complicated treasures like armors and weapons. But hours ago, when he first took out those plates, the eyes of the Morales ancestors couldn't help but light up. Those plates weren't just forged of a single metal, they were instead a composite of them, a beautifully refined alloy. But what was especially shocking was that even with their sharp eyes, it took them several hours of observation to realize this. Of course, they had known that it had to be something special because it was a metal they didn't recognize. With their wisdom and years of experience, how could there possibly be an or they didn't recognize? But it was also because of that confusion that they realized how beautifully forged this alloy was, so perfect that it made them doubt themselves. This metal alloy, without a doubt, had reached the level of the life grade. It had reached a level where it seemed that nature itself had created it. When the ancestors realized this, they also came to understand just what Lionel had planned. He was using a self-created alloy as the foundation for this formation he was creating, which also meant that this formation, whatever it was also self-created. However, even with this being the case, when they saw Lionel enter the central core of the village, their hearts couldn't help but skip several beats. This was insane. That was all they could describe it as. Although Lionel's choice to challenge the bronze and silver grades were crazy to the majority, that was mostly because many still saw him as a six-dimensional existence back then. If it had been Armand, or the sword deity, or Adderworth who had forced through such challenges, they could still accept it. That was because in the worst scenario, these geniuses could take center stage and force victory using their own power. But when it came to the gold grade, no matter how you looked at it, it was simply impossible for one to do that on their own, and there was no sudden landscape change that could help now either, and even if there were, given the sheer number of enemies that could be coming. Even if Lionel could somehow manifest another mountain from thin air, it simply wouldn't be enough to deal with them all. There were already over 12,000 enemies in the silver grade upgrade challenge. The number to face in the gold grade upgrade challenge would be 100 times that at over 1,000,000. To make matters worse, Lionel would have to face 3 times that amount. Right now, even after recalling 2 troops of Oryx, Lionel only had 4,000 subordinates. If he included the Sky's family who had recovered by now, that was 14,000. And, even if he included the 10,000 or so souls he had claimed from, that was still not even 1% of the number of enemies he would be facing soon. As though that wasn't enough, on top of that, he had sent his strongest individual combatants away. Whether it was Aina, James, Elther, Noah, or the others, they were currently away on the tasks Lionel had set aside from them. At this point, even the Morales ancestors wanted to reach through the screen and tell him to stop. But it was already too late. Lionel brought out his other 2 city cores and threw them forward. Chapter 1964. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1964. Worries if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1964 worries. The ground began to rumble. The near immediate commotion was so great that it made Lionel's ears ring. Even so, he walked out from the core of the village calmly. Take your positions on the wall. The rest will be left up to me, Lionel said lightly. The Sky's family and the Oryx were already in position. However, the way they took up their positions could only be said to be odd. Along the walls, there were only enough positions for a few hundred of them. With what could only be described as precise organization, they formed lines behind these positions, only one stepping up and onto the wall at a time. At the same time, at the end of the line, a sleeping pod was lined up. These first few hundred in the first batch positioned themselves behind railguns that reminded them eerily of the one Alan had used previously to hold off the Constellation Bow Alliance. However, these somehow seemed more complete. Despite seeing this, the worry on the brows of the Morales family elders only deepened. What were a few hundred railguns going to do? Even if it was thousands, it wouldn't be enough. These beasts were created to not have consciences. They didn't care about how many of their allies were dying, and they only felt bloodlust. Their only thoughts were of rushing forward as quickly as possible and reaping as many lives as they could. Even if 100,000 fell, another 100,000 would be right there to replace them, even if it was the last 100,000. They had no concept of morale or momentum. Normal war tactics simply wouldn't work. These upgrade challenges were designed to mimic the real-life patterns of invalids. There was simply no simple way to deal with them, and lining the walls with a few guns just seemed foolhardy. These upgrade challenges were designed to mimic the real-life patterns of invalids. There was simply no simple way to deal with them, and lining the walls with a few guns just seemed foolhardy. The only saving grace was that if the upgrade failed and the walls fell, Lionel could at least run away, but that would also unleash these millions of invalids on the continent. At the same time, that would ruin all of Lionel's progress and his advantages would vanish into thin air. At this point, even those who wanted Lionel to fail didn't say anything. They didn't feel there was a point, the outcome felt inevitable. However, whether this was an outcome that Lionel wanted or not was what they were on the fence about. Now that they thought about it, maybe Lionel had sent his most powerful combatants away on purpose. What if this was another scheme of his? This worry had resulted in them remaining silent. It seemed that Lionel's previous successes had left their scars. Even at this point, many were hesitant to make their final judgments. As Lionel stepped into the air calmly, his expression indifferent and his coarse linen shirt and pants ruffling in the wind, his confidence seemed to be palpable. The ground continued to rumble as Lionel continued to rise into the air, a simple silver-gold platform of emulation spatial force becoming his seat as he flew several hundred meters into the air. He closed his eyes, seemingly unable to sense the rumbling ground at all. However, his lips slightly parted. "Fire," Lionel said lightly. His voice was soft amidst the rumbling, and yet it traveled to each one of their ears. The few hundred on the walls gripped the handles of their railguns tight, swinging them forward. A black sea of enemies appeared not even a kilometer away. Their roars and clanging weapons grated on the ears, a suffocating heat and bloody scent quickly rising through the air. They seemed endless, felt boundless. And then the first railguns fired. Sparking lightning howled and solid rays of golden-yellow lasers streaked across the air, their projectiles hidden within. The first volley connected with the front line, causing a rain of blood and gore to surge into the skies. Just a single ray seemed to take out dozens before it was eventually blocked. After a collective volley, thousands had fallen. The railguns swung once more, lightning sparking once again as they fired. The loading process seemed smooth and seamless. Once again, another few thousand died. However, what was a few thousand to several million? And to make matters worse, after just 2 volleys, the marksmen were already pale. Most would only be able to withstand just a single more volley, while all of them only have a maximum of 4 to give. The situation seemed helpless, and yet Lionel's voice descended calmly. Swap. The lines shifted forward. The first group fell back and rushed to enter the resting pods, and a new marksman stepped in on each railgun. Renewed and rejuvenated, the firing continued at the same rhythm, not a single beat was missed. By the time the army had closed the distance by half, almost 10 volleys had been sent and over 50,000 had died. There was no doubt that Lionel's approach was effective, but it still felt like it wasn't nearly enough. But it was at this moment that Lionel slowly opened his eyes. They didn't seem sharp. In fact, they seemed almost dull and lifeless, almost as though his attention was elsewhere. Down below, the army was only 100 or so meters away from crossing the first line of his formation, and he was ready and prepared. 3 silver stars appeared to Lionel's back, slowly rotating as large amounts of dream force rushed into his body, replenishing his mind and soothing his soul. Then, one after another, familiar valiant souls began to appear on the battlefield. Donned in violet battle armor, they seemed prepared to face the world. Even so, when they appeared, the hearts of the Morales family elders sank. If Lionel had done something else, anything else, they would have still had some hope. But they had already seen this trick before. It had already been pushed to the limits when Lionel had to take on his most recent silver grade upgrade. What good would it be here? Despite this, Lionel couldn't seem to sense the worries of anyone else. 2 more stars appeared to his back, runes beginning to dance across its surface. The temperature skyrocketed as the twin pair of red-gold balls of fire appeared. At that moment, one after another, the eyes of the soul constructs below suddenly began to blaze with fire as well. Scarlet Star Force. Chapter 1965. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 8 seconds p.m. Chapter 1965. Real if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1965 Real. At that moment, the demeanor of the soul constructs completely changed. No, it was more accurate to say that it felt as though 10,000 Lionels had appeared at once, all powerful and all equally as real. All at once, they raised their palms and 10,000 bows appeared. These weren't soul constructs or creations of emulation spatial force. They were real, tangible bows that could have only been forged by the segmented cube. Although each one only exuded the aura of the bronze grade, when they entered the palms of the soul constructs, they suddenly became the weapons of a king. They drew their bowstrings back at once, their backs straight and their gazes sharp. The instant the first line of army crossed the formation line, they fired. The speed of firing for Lionel and his soul constructs was far faster than any volleys the human domain had seen until now. Scarlet Star Force tore through everything in its path, burning everything it touched. The violent destruction made any previous carnage look like nothing more than a joke. Every time another troll fell, a slight ripple would pass through the formation, resurrecting their soul. After a small moment, 2 balls of fire would flicker to life in their eyes and they would suddenly become completely different people. It very quickly became obvious that Lionel wasn't using his soul constructs as usual. As time passed, the worry that weighed down the hearts of the Morales ancestor was slowly becoming lighter and lighter. They stood in a daze, their eyes locked onto the youth sitting cross-legged in the skies. Very few knew that Lionel had Scarlet Star Force. The matters that happened that day in the Rapak's nest had been practically ignored by the members of the Cataclysm generation, and not much of this had spread. Coupling this with the fact that Lionel had been within the Void Palace when he displayed much of these abilities, and the wider human domain was even more in the dark. It was impossible to see even a top 3 force in any given category, but Lionel had already made use of the number 1 water force and the number 1 fire force. What was even more shocking than that was the fact that this Scarlet Star Force was on a level that made even the hearts of the ancestors tremble. Was this power a 6-dimensional existence should have? Eventually, the line of defense was overwhelmed. The flood of enemies was simply too many. Lionel's bows alone, even 10,000 of them, couldn't counter them completely. However, Lionel's expression didn't change in the slightest, the same dull, glass-like look remaining. In that moment, his soul constructs tossed their bows to the side and flipped their palms to reveal spears. Each one of these spears was of a different caliber, and yet revealed absolutely shocking auras one after another. Not a single one of them was short of the life grade. So many powerful spears could only come from one place, and that was when a shocking realization shook the human domain. No matter how powerful the spear domain ring, one could only use a single spear at a time. However, somehow, Lionel had completely shattered this concept. The resonating howls of thousands of life-grade spears shook the earth and dispersed the clouds above. It felt like the army of millions wasn't the coming tide, but rather the group of soul constructs standing in silence. Their Myers Conrad, the Morales ancestors, looked toward the old and wrinkled man and were stunned to see a bright smile on his face. Even amongst the ancestors, there were hierarchies, and Ancestor Hito was without a doubt amongst the most senior and most respected. Ancestor Alvaro had been a toddler when he first saw this man, and he was already an ancestor back then. He was simply on a completely different level. Not once had they ever seen this old man smile, and here he was, grinning from ear to ear. This formation is a stroke of genius. We will probably never understand its intricacies without also comprehending the lineage factor that Littlest Nova is using to give it such strength, but the general gist of it is clear. It disperses and amplifies dream force. Its function is that simple and can be summarized in just those few words. However, what's especially ingenious about it is the fact that this dream force isn't casually constructed dream force, nor does it come from the atmosphere. If I am correct, Littlest Nova's original ability index doesn't allow him to project dream force. Instead, he's using this formation as a proxy for his mind and his soul, blanketing the entire region and treating the entire region as his limbs. Dream force seems like an enigmatic concept to most, but that's only to those who had no affinity for it. Do you know why dream force is so dangerous? Why coming into contact with it is a life-changing and often ending event? It's because dream force is an unruly child. It simply flows as it pleases, finding vessels that it wants to invade. When this dream force is ownerless, one ends up in an endless cycle of memories. However, what if it was owned? What if this dream force was under the control of another? What if this owned dream force ran into an easily manipulated and malleable soul construct? Those soul constructs are no longer who they once were. For all intents and purposes, they are Littlest Nova. They are more real than any clone in existence has ever been. Chapter 1966. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 6 seconds p.m. Chapter 1966, Another. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again 1966 another. Through these clones, Lionel could extend his affinities. It felt like his mage core had multiplied over several thousand times, allowing him to call down atmospheric force from thousands of locations at once. With his stars as an anchor, it further allowed him to extend the ability to use Scarlet Star Force to each and every one of his soul constructs. However, even this was only the tip of the iceberg. It felt that rather than controlling his clones, he was rather controlling extra limbs of his. With those souls as the mediums, all of Lionel archery skills, all of his spearmanship, all of his mage and knight abilities cascaded forth, crushing everything they ran into. Every time another enemy fell, yet another warrior would be added to the total. They rose up with flickering crimson flames in their eyes, marching forth with a deathly momentum. From time to time, hundreds of railguns would fire at once, taking out dozens more each. Even when Lionel's clones were enveloped by a strike, they would ripple once and collapse, only to reform and begin their slaughter once again. Without having to worry about crushing allies, the Sky's family and the Oryx released volley after volley, draining themselves and then retreating to the back of the line before the process started all over again. Any projectile that could drain a seventh-dimensional existence in just 3 attempts was bound to be supremely powerful. Because Lionel wasn't worried about their recovery, he had gone all out. Even the current him could only fire those railguns a dozen or so times before he had nothing left. That was why he hadn't bothered to execute the crafting of more than a few hundred. All of a sudden, it wasn't Lionel's combat prowess that was on full display, but rather his crafting. The danger he posed to those of the human domain skyrocketed. This was an individual who was not only highly intelligent, he was likewise highly talented and powerful. On top of that, unlike his father who could only be described as a headstrong loner, Lionel seemed to be an exceptional leader who was willing to rely on others to execute his orders. He was nothing short of a monster. Lionel gasped for breath, his dull gaze regaining its sharpness as his platform of emulation spatial force wavered. He truly looked like he had nothing left to give, but by now, there were only a few thousand gold-grade threats remaining and his army of soul constructs had already grown to millions. Even if Lionel could no longer control them, dealing with the rest was like using a steamroller to crush an egg. Lionel landed on the ground, his chest heaving. Every breath he took seemed to cause a hurricane-like event, the rushing wind falling into the endless abyss that was his lungs. The good news about having such great vitality was that reaching this point of fatigue was almost impossible. The bad news was that when he did, recovering was far more difficult for him than it was for most. Even so, Lionel looked forward as a wave of gold spread across his territory, their range increasing from 400 kilometers to 500 kilometers. By this point, what once was the light of dawn was already beginning to wane as evening approached. The battle had taken quite a period of time and many changes could have taken place in this time. Even so, Lionel dragged his body into a pod and didn't exit until an hour later, the equivalent of 4 days of rest. At this moment, his soul constructs still stood in silence, like wisps of violet in the wind that could be blown to dust at any moment. They'll last at most about 15 or so hours. That's enough time. Lionel took a deep breath. The strength of his soul constructs would only be able to mirror his own strength when they were within his formation. However, outside of his formation, they would revert back to their original combat strength. That said, this wasn't terrible for multiple reasons. Firstly, that majority of them were gold grade now, making them quite effective and powerful. Although they couldn't match up to the heirs, they were stronger than many subordinates, or at least on par with many of them. Secondly, while it sounded nice to be able to perfectly control them as though they were his limbs, doing so drained a great deal of his stamina. If Lionel let them fight on their own, the stamina he would save was enormous. Lionel's figure flickered and he entered the core of the village. In truth, it could no longer be called a village now, it was well and truly a city, and the core of it reflected that. The ceilings were tall, the pillars were thick, and now Lionel could sit upon a throne to investigate the changes to the core. As expected, his outposts had upgraded and now had the added function of instant teleportation. This would save them a great deal of time and effort. Lionel now had over 3 million kill exchanges burning a hole in his pocket. That many gold-grade kill exchanges were worth 30 billion points. Though this was short of the 500 billion points he would need to upgrade this city into an air grade 1, it was still a substantial sum. Without hesitation, Lionel attempted to use 1 billion points to expand his city limits from 500 kilometers to 2,000. However, he realized instantly that there was a blockage. The first blockage was to his back, about 600 or so kilometers away, or about 100 kilometers from his border, there was the ocean. According to this system, he wasn't allowed to expand his territory limits into the ocean without an underwater territory. The other blockages, to his sides and toward the front, were other territories. It turned out that the reason he had been able to see the location of the second Tor territory was because its owner, Armand, had already died. As such, it had been ownerless at the time. But he couldn't just steamroll territories with his own by buying more. Even so, Lionel grinned, he had found another loophole. Comment view all. Chapter 1967. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 4 seconds p.m. Chapter 1967. 80% if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again 1967 80% during that attempt to expand territory. The failure points were clearly noted. Although it was only for a brief moment, and the option to expand had already been grayed out, just how good was Lionel's memory, exactly? Although the Umbra family had already given him the location of the most important territories, they happened to be the largest and most prominent. In the end, there were only a few hundred Umbra family members that had come. Given the scope of the air wars, it was difficult for them to get everything. Of course, the Umbra family had far from just this many seventh-dimensional existence beneath 100 years old, but convincing them to bring out a few hundred in the first place already took quite a bit of convincing. One had to remember that the Umbra family was meant to be a weak sixth-dimensional family. Having just a single seventh-dimensional existence was already a big deal, let alone a few hundred. It had to be remembered that back then, even their patriarch, Xylem Umbra, wasn't even at tier 4 of the 6th dimension yet. This meant that Lionel could only work with what he had, which was also why it had felt to Radlease that Lionel was working with information they hadn't even given him. That was because all this time, Lionel had been piecing together a picture of the day side based on several sources. The Umbra family was only one of those sources, and now he had gained another. There was another matter to consider as well. The Umbra family was already currently on the night side, gathering up intel. It had been over a quarter day since Lionel saw them last. With how fast things were moving, there had most definitely already been changes to the information they had given him. This was a huge boon. Excellent. Expand to the greatest limit, Lionel confirmed. At that moment, a whooshing sound extended and Lionel's territory expanded an extra 100 kilometers toward his back, an extra 200 to the east and west, and finally, the largest change, an extra 600 to the north. It was unsurprising that there was such a large gap to the north, as that was the direction of both the former Constellation Biyao alliance and the Tor family. It was ironically his own territory, the one he had sent the cloud race to impersonate, that had stopped him from expanding forward. That said, it was also because he had sent the Oryx to clear out several regions in all locations that he had this much room to his left, right and back as well. His preparations had given and taken to them. In addition to this, Lionel had learned something else. Apparently, it was only by upgrading to the air grade could he forcefully assimilate territory. However, that wouldn't help with the ocean. Essentially, he would be able to claim the entire supercontinent if he reached the air grade. But even for Lionel, he knew that this was pushing it. He had just given everything he had to clear the gold grade. Although he could rely on his more powerful people like Aina, James, and the others, it would truly be a tall mountain to climb. The air challenge was different. Firstly, the enemies would still mostly be at the gold grade, however there would be around 10 million of them rather than just over 1 million like before. In addition, rather than being a random tidal wave, they would be led by 100 air grade generals designed to mimic variant invalids. They would be an organized army and threat, and their commanders would be at an air level. It wasn't something that Lionel could take casually, even if he made great preparations. It should be about now. The timing is right. Just as Lionel had this thought, the flash of several teleportations took shape as figure after figure began to appear within the core throne room of the city. Once again, Lionel's timing was immaculate. At this moment, James, Emna, as well as Aina, his brothers, and the others had all returned. None of them seemed surprised that Lionel had cleared the gold grade without them. This had always been the plan. Lionel turned toward them and nodded. "Tell me about your gains and then go rest in the pods. We will move out again within the hour." James and Emna came forward first. The two of them had been away for the longest and had the most accumulated gains. At the same time, they were the two in most need for rest, so it was only right that they came forward first. Between the two of them, they had accumulated over 50 million points, a shocking total. This would already be enough for one to challenge their gold grade upgrade. While compared to Lionel's current almost 30 billion, it wasn't worth much. The fact that they had gotten so much just clearing bronze and silver grade challenges and dungeons spoke volumes about how much effort they had put in. That said, Lionel was less concerned about the points and more concerned about the rewards themselves. It was a silver grade dungeons reward that had given Lionel the advantage in clearing the silver grade upgrade condition without many subordinates. He couldn't neglect such rewards. Lionel quickly shifted through the rewards they had gained and made several calculations. Between the two, they had cleared about a dozen dungeons each, most of which were silver grade. Although they didn't always get the air grade reward due to various circumstances unrelated to their combat strength, they had gotten it the majority of the time as well. A tunnel reward. A silver grade instant pass reward. A territory protector reward. A wall collapsing reward. A territory masking reward. Suddenly, Lionel's eyes lit up. This could be useful, very useful. He had seen another potential loophole, and this could change a great deal of things. If he was correct and used this reward appropriately, he should be able to extend his territory into the ocean, but even he wasn't certain if this loophole would work with 100% certainty. There should be about a 80% chance. Worth it to try. Chapter 1968. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 4 seconds p.m. Chapter 1968. Decision: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1968 decision. Lionel plucked the reward and rolled it between his fingers for a moment. Then, with a thought, he pushed it toward the core of the city and agreed to accept the change. After a wild bout of vertigo, everyone opened their eyes to smell an air that was decidedly more humid, refreshing and salty. Even from here, they could hear the sounds of the crashing waves. Without even looking out of the city, they could tell that they had all suddenly been moved to the ocean side. Lionel didn't flinch after this happened, he had already expected it. Without hesitation, he pushed forward a second reward and accepted it as well. The ground rumbled and the sound of heavy rocks crashing into the ocean resounded. Many who didn't know what was going on rushed to the city walls, and their eyes widened as they felt that the city was about to fall right off a cliff and into the raging waters below. However, just when it seemed that this would happen, the city stabilized and became rock solid. Waters rushed in from the side, and the moat that had surrounded the city before was filled instantly with a rush of heavy salt water. It felt like, in that moment, the city was enveloped by the embrace of the ocean. The mountain range they had been hidden within was completely gone, and they found themselves on soft, sandy land. If not for the fact that this was a simulation and not completely analogous to real life, there was no way such a heavy structure could exist on such fragile land. At the same time, they had been right near a cliff face which had now crumbled and collapsed, lowering their elevation and causing a rush of ocean water to tide in. Their city was now half perched on sand and another half in the ocean, and with their moat, they felt a step away from being entirely submerged. In order to accomplish this, Lionel had done two things. The first was that he used a territory moving reward. Since it was just silver grade, it only allowed him to move his territory to anywhere within his territory's range. However, given the size of his territory to begin with, that gave him access to over half the supercontinent. Then, he used yet another terrain change reward, but this one, rather than being used for mountains, was instead used to direct waterways. Its original purpose was to create a source of water by extending it from a primary source. So, Lionel used it on the ocean and extended it into their moat. Only underwater territories were allowed to expand into the ocean. Well, was he not technically underwater now? His city limits had been entirely submerged in ocean water. Even if Lionel was just trying his luck, using these rewards like this still only benefited him. Although he had abandoned the mountain range, attacking his territory like this was even more difficult because you could only send an army from a single direction now, in addition to the fact the moat was even heavier. But it seemed that Lionel wouldn't have to worry about only having this to gain. When he saw that his territory map now extended into the depths of the ocean, he almost couldn't refrain from grinning ear to ear. The ocean was vast, just as vast as any one of the supercontinents, so Lionel wasn't anywhere near close to mapping it all out. His territory should have extended 2,000 kilometers from his city now, or rather, however far it could go before it ran into other territories, but territory distance was counted differently within the ocean. There seemed to be a 100 times reduction. Lionel wasn't surprised by this. On land, territory only had to account for 2 dimensions, but with the water, depth had become very important. Now, his territory map wasn't flat, but it also had to incorporate a distance down to the greatest depth of the ocean. But even then, because he had 2,000 kilometers, to 20 kilometers in this case, in perfect detail, the things he could see were almost too much. The ocean's depth ranged from 5 kilometers to 20 kilometers. This was far deeper than a moon of this size should have had, but it was likely that ancestor Hito had done this on purpose. Challenges and dungeons appeared at all depths, and because of the difficulty in reaching them, they were far more tightly packed. In just this 20-kilometer range that Lionel could see, there were already over 200 challenges and over 4 dozen dungeons. Half of those were bronze grade, about a quarter were silver grade, however there were over 40 gold grade challenges and almost 10 were air grade. At the same time, there were over 15 gold grade dungeons and 5 air grade ones. To put this into perspective, the land had yet to even spawn gold grade challenges and dungeons. Only now that Lionel's territory had become gold grade would it start to. This was completely game-changing. As though this wasn't enough, Lionel had also spotted the territory of several air-grade oceanic beasts as well. Each one of them was worth 100,000 points so long as they were killed. This is a huge treasure trove. If others tapped into this, all of the effort I put into getting ahead would be completely crushed. I expected this possibility, but it's even more exaggerated than I assumed. Lionel narrowed his eyes. He was very much correct. Right now, the Pisk and Quarius families were behind, but once they entered the ocean, their advantages would skyrocket with great speed. In just a few steps, they would go from the bottom ranks of constellation families to amongst the top ranks. Even so, the advantage that Lionel had was even greater. Who could afford to buy 2,000 kilometers worth of territory right now in exchange for 20 kilometers worth of information? Beyond that, he was even planning on pouring all 30 billion points he had not into underwater outposts to extend this range. The gold-grade underwater outposts each cost 10 million, and each one had a range of just 1 kilometer, but if 20 kilometers of space had this much information, how much would 300 kilometers have? Lionel didn't care about points right now, there were only a few things he could spend them on to begin with. However, if he managed to monopolize a large number of air-grade dungeons, the rewards he gathered from them could put him so far ahead that the air wars would become meaningless. If the silver-grade rewards for these dungeons were already so useful, what could the air-grade ones do for him? Lionel's expression flickered. He had a decision to make. He currently had over 3 million soul constructs that would only last for a few more hours. He knew that they wouldn't be enough to conquer the supercontinent, but he did know that they would be enough to wreak havoc. He was very understanding about the strength of the heirs. If the gold grade upgrade was 1 million, that meant that very soon, the heirs would be able to deal with it. And if he made such a large commotion, he would attract public ire even sooner, not to mention make it even easier for them to deal with it by giving them a reason to band together. If he could separate out this army of 3 million, it would be one thing. But they were soul constructs held together by his lineage factor, he had to be there to direct them and he couldn't move his formation freely to use clones as a stand-in. The other option was, of course, to press his advantage and claim as many gold and air-grade rewards as possible, so that when he was eventually ganged up on anyway, they wouldn't stand a chance. Lionel fell into his thoughts. He couldn't afford a misstep. Chapter 1969. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:06 and 1 p.m. Chapter 1969. How? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1969. How? Lionel raised his head, a flash of what felt like violet lightning coursing through his irises. Not every step could be meticulous and perfect. Not every scheme could be without pitfalls. Without perfect information, even he couldn't guarantee a result. His simulations were only as good as the data he put into them. In that case, he would have to force the issue, suffocate his enemies until they didn't have the option to add variables to his calculations in the first place. Go and rest. Catch up when you can, I'm setting out now. The gazes of those present flashed, but they didn't say anything. In these air wars, Lionel had the final say and they had already accepted it. If they hadn't, they wouldn't be following him in the first place. Lionel stepped out, casually waving a hand and using the territory protection award that the others had gathered. These rewards summoned a protector spirit based on the strength of your territory at the time of the summoning. As such, Lionel's territory gained 3 large spirit animals with the strength of about 100,000 gold-grade threats. This didn't mean that they were 100,000 times stronger than a gold-grade threat, but rather that it would take the all-out attack of that many gold-grade threats over the course of a few hours to take them down. After he did this, Lionel raised a hand and little Blackstar seemed to appear from nowhere, landing on his palm and snaking up toward his neck in a hurry. Lionel smiled and rubbed the little guy's head. Little Blackstar seemed to have reached his maximum size. Even after entering the 7th dimension, he didn't grow past 2 to 3 feet long. The way he draped over Lionel smiled and rubbed the little guy's head. Little Blackstar seemed to have reached his maximum size. Even after entering the 7th dimension, he didn't grow past 2 to 3 feet long. The way he draped over Lionel's shoulders wasn't much different from a thick scarf. We're gonna wreak some havoc, Blackstar. Yip. Yip. Blackstar trembled and suddenly wrapped around Lionel with great speed, becoming nothing more than a blur of black before a large amount of dark force to shape into a prowling black dragon. Little Blackstar sat in its forehead, clearly visible, until the dark force became so thick and viscous that he vanished entirely. The creature opened its mouth and roared. At that moment, the entire Air Wars moon trembled and quaked. The slowly darkening skies seemed to suddenly enter the depths of night in a single step. Little Blackstar raised a claw and planted it on the sturdy gold-grade walls, raising his head to the skies as he continued to bellow. The war cry reached the ears of the heirs across the 2 continents, even piercing into the ocean waters and causing the waves to rise and rock. Lionel's figure flickered and he appeared on Little Blackstar's head. His aura soared, a piercing spear howl becoming the only point of light in the skies. The soul constructs below shifted and stomped, the echo of their footsteps fusing into Little Blackstar's roar and Lionel's spear howl. A radiant halo appeared above Lionel's head, descending down his body and forming a vibrant armor that shook with vital star form. The towering sky blue and gold standing amidst a mass of deep and impregnable, roaring black made the man atop of the world the center of attention. Decisive. This was the only word the elders of the human domain could think. They could see everything Lionel could see, and with their experience, they knew well what thoughts he must have in his head at this moment. But rather than trying to tuck away until he had victory 100% confirmed, he chose this route instead. To try and confirm victory would underestimate the geniuses of the human domain far too much. While Lionel was advantaged now, he had his weaknesses. They had already seen that he had limitations in terms of both subordinate count and subordinate strength. If he didn't take advantage of his lead now, he might never get the chance. The Morales family elders nodded. Lionel had not only proved them wrong several times, but he also knew when to not go against the majority's thoughts and take the most logical route, even when that most logical route, like this time, took a great deal of wisdom to take. At the same time, the worry on the brows of the other elders deepened. However, no matter how much they wanted to reach into the glass cube and put a stop to it, Lionel's army began to march, their momentum stifling. They didn't try to hide themselves in the slightest. No amount of preparation on their enemy's part would matter. Their only outcome would be to be steamrolled. To the west, the Pisk and Quarius families looked up. Just as Lionel had expected, they were already making their move into the ocean, claiming several seaside territories as they began to look for their first underwater territory. What was surprising, though, was that these two constellation families were actually working together. But when one thought about it, this was less surprising in reality. The best genius of the Quarius family, Queen Beauty Vega Quarius, had joined First Nova. Without anyone to take up the reins, the Quarius family was reeling. Rather than simply not participating, though, they preferred to team up with the Pisk family. Together, as the two prominent water force families, they made a plan to conquer the oceans. However, hearing the roar, their gazes couldn't help but narrow. The leader of the Pisk, Marina, and the current leader of the Quarius, Vega's younger sister, Pearl, both seemed to react at the same time, their expressions solemn. They began to gather up their subordinates, sending out calls for returns as well, shoring up their defenses and looking toward the towering spear howl in the distance as a mass of violet moved toward them swiftly. By this point, their numbers were already well in the thousands, but even between the two of them, they only had about 100,000 or so subordinates, and that was after focusing everything on getting as many kill exchanges as possible. This mass of enemies. How would they deal with this? Chapter 1970. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:05 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1970, Humans. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1970 Humans. Seeing their numbers, Lionel knew that he had made the right decision. As he had expected, after a certain point, the number of subordinates the heirs and the others could accumulate would only increase exponentially. It was just simple math. A single person could only get one kill exchange at the same time, multiplying themselves to 2. But 2 people could get 4, and 4 could get 8. Of course, the Quarius and Pisk families were still a bit of an anomaly. They had focused entirely on gathering up as many people as possible because their goal was the ocean. With the depth and vastness, they needed numbers to explore and press their advantage. Lionel felt that this was the wrong approach, and he would likely be proved right by those who had focused on other things having numbers that were comparable enough. But their mistakes had nothing to do with him. Within an hour, it'll crush them. Lionel had steamrolled over every small faction on the way here, sending the Oryx he came across back to rest and ordering them to circle around and support the Tator family. His momentum was already at its peak when he waved a hand and gripped his black rod, raising it into the skies. Right then, a wall destruction reward surged forward. The others had accumulated 3 of these total, and though they could only be used against silver-grade territories and below. Who other than Lionel had a gold-grade territory? The expressions of Marina and Pearl changed immediately, but there was nothing they could do. They leapt into the air, dodging out of the way of the crumbling walls as their city was exposed to the masses. Lionel's spear raised its apex and Little Blackstar opened his jaws, his chest expanding. The latter's head stretched over 100 meters into the skies, his preparation causing the air to shake and quake. Suddenly. Roar! A billowing cyclone of darkness surged out from his gaping mouth, tearing a path toward the crumbling wall. Marina and Pearl's expressions changed once again. They had vaguely felt that the creature beneath Lionel should have just been a construct, but when it attacked, they were taken completely off guard. Was that really a dragon? They had only heard myths about such beasts, there should have been any real occurrences of them. Damn it. Marines pulled at a silk fabric wrapped around her slender waist. Pearl reacted at the same time, pulling out a tall, blue-scaled trident. The two rushed forward, looking to block the Black Breath attack. Although they felt it was still manageable, they didn't want the battle to start with such devastating losses. While they were capable of dealing with it, that didn't mean that the others were. As the two heirs, they had to take this sort of burden on their shoulders. However, before they could even properly, Lionel rod expanded, blotting out the skies as it descended in a torrent of rotating spear force. Lionel unleashed a furious roar that resonated with little black stars, his blue vital star force turning a furious red, then instantly a vibrant violet as he activated Star Fusion, King's Might. The two young women attacked, but found themselves meeting an immutable wall. With his spear domain lineage factor activated, Lionel's spear passed through little black star's roar as though it wasn't there at all, not interfering with it in the slightest. But the same couldn't be said for the two women. They were blown backward, their gazes helpless as they watched little black star's dark force breath shred everything in its path. What made them shudder instantly was that they realized they had underestimated little black star far too much. The attack had felt manageable just now, but when it descended, it swallowed up all the force in its path, gathering it into its strength and continuing forward. It was like anarchic force. Lionel rose into the skies, allowing Blackstar to wreak havoc below as he reached out a hand. The tidal wave of soul constructs surged forward into the remaining shambles of the army. Even when they managed to kill a soul construct, another one would take its place while the one that had fallen would reform and join the battle once again. The morale of the Pisk and Quarius families plummeted, but Lionel only kept churning away at them, his forward momentum relentless. Not even an hour later, there was nothing but ruins. Corpses littered the ground and the territory was swallowed up. At that moment, the borders of Lionel's territory expanded, pushing past the barrier that had once been there and taking this land for itself. At that moment, streaks appeared from the horizon. Aina, James, Noah, Emna, Raylion, Aphestus, his brothers, and the other geniuses of Earth caught up one after another. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. He shifted the direction of the army, his mind swirling with the images of the boundaries he had seen before. After settling the direction, he began to press forward with an even faster pace. He had 13 hours left to maximize these 3 million troops. He would destroy everything he could. Dancing red-gold flames lit his pupils. The commotion that Lionel had caused wasn't small, however there was a reason he didn't try to hide his tracks. Firstly, the commotion of his gold grade upgrade wasn't small. Million charging with 7th dimensional strength was bound to cause a great tidal wave across the moon. Secondly, he wanted to impose his will. This was precisely what had happened. Although ganging up and defeating a powerful enemy sounded logical, humans were selfish. Before it was necessary, they would bide their time and hope someone else dealt with it while they benefited, and with the strategic placement of the Cloud race members, Lionel could nudge things in the direction. With everyone holding up, all of his targets were in just a single place, and very quickly, the scouts of the Libra family rushed with news of his actions. Third chapter is coming, but maybe much later. Chapter 1971. Published at 28th of June 2023 1:05 and 57 seconds p.m. Chapter 1971. Kiza if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again 1971 Kiza 1, Droid, Hewlett and Druid all looked forward with shock. Listening to the report of their subordinate, they didn't know how to react immediately. They had upgraded their main territory to the silver grade not long ago and they were preparing to continue their momentum swiftly as they approached the appropriate time to unleash their trump card and deal with Lionel. But they didn't expect that Lionel would react before they could. To the side, Kiza, the heir of the Gamine family, a young woman that Lionel had met and clashed with during the true selection of the Void Palace. Back then, Kiza had taken interest in Lionel because her mother had been one of the many to fall for his father, Velasco. She was very curious to learn about that man through Lionel, mostly because her mother was a woman she couldn't see falling for anyone. Of course, that included her father who she had little to no respect for. It could be said that Kiza took after her mother in her disregard for most men. Unfortunately, she didn't get the chance to probe Lionel as much as she had wanted as the true selection had been too hectic back then, not to mention the cataclysm that occurred not long afterward. However, hearing about his movements now, her interest had suddenly returned. In truth, she didn't think of Lionel much, and decades had passed since then. She was surprised, though, when the Libra family chose to change up their original plans by moving their cooperation up. When she learned that it was because of Lionel and the fact he had already taken out Nazag, she became even more intrigued. Her eyes couldn't help but narrow, a playful smile spreading across her vibrant pink lips. What do we do? How did he gather millions of subordinates already? Juan spoke with furrowed brows. It's not millions of subordinates. Kiza suddenly spoke. Their heads turned toward her all at once. Although she had a playful smile on her face, they didn't take it as a joke. Kiza looked like an airhead, but in terms of intelligence, she was ranked amongst the best of the human domain. There was a long time, before Lionel had done it, that many believed that if anyone were to surpass the scorned Queen Beauty on the Void Library's leader list, it would be her. But for whatever reason, Kiza had never bothered to enter the Void Library. They're soul constructs. You people really have no idea how the soul works, tsk. Hewlett and Druid, the two female Libra family members, were very much annoyed by Kiza's antics. But Juan and Droid, who had practically grown up with her, were already wrapped around her little finger. Despite their genius, they practically just did as she pleased, which was also why it was so surprising to Kiza when they contacted her to change their original plans. Much like Y's Star Order had told Lionel all those years ago, the Gamine family was the only family of the human domain with any true understanding of the soul, and that was because their lineage factor allowed them far more free range than most humans. As such, when Kiza had sensed the unique fluctuations in some of the battles Lionel had fought, she had already sensed the uniqueness. Now hearing that he had suddenly manifested millions of subordinates, she put two and two together. Soul constructs. Where would he get so many soul constructs? By killing, of course. The group of four frowned, they didn't understand. Kiza shrugged. I'm very curious about certain things. The person who fascinates me more is Alienor Morales. I really wanted to know what about her was so much better than my mother, so I investigated her. She has a very uncanny ability to use soul constructs, and this was obviously passed down to her little boy. Although Kiza was smiling, Juan and Droid looked away from her gaze, feeling a cold shiver down their backs. The two had had a crush on Kiza for the longest time, but they had never bothered to pursue her. That was because this woman had no heart. If that cold lump of coal in her chest opened up for anyone, it was her mother and her mother alone. Often, that love crossed a line that mother and daughter shouldn't have, and it also turned into a level of fanaticism that led to results like this. Although Kiza was speaking casually, the amount of killing intent she was exuding was palpable. There was no doubt she wanted to kill Alienor. Even so, that doesn't explain where he would get so many soul constructs. Also, if he could get millions of kill exchanges, why wouldn't he exchange them for real people? Druid and Hewlett, who didn't understand Kiza as well, asked with questioning tones. Their two cousins shuddered but didn't say anything. Can't you Libras use your heads? There are two of you and you practically share all thoughts, shouldn't that make you smarter? First of all, using soul constructs wouldn't necessarily stop you from using kill exchanges, they're mutually exclusive. Secondly, where would he get millions of subordinates from? He entered the air war games later than anyone. Earth is still too weak to produce so many seventh-dimensional experts, while the Morales wouldn't provide him with such support for the sake of fairness. If I'm correct, he's probably already converted all of his kills into points by now. As for where he would get millions of kill exchanges, that's even more obvious. What is the easiest way to gain kill exchanges? Their eyes suddenly widened and they stood to their feet. Gold grade? Already? How is that possible? The hearts of the Libra family shook. To clear the gold grade, one had to have the equivalent of millions of subordinates. Even if they were soul constructs, didn't gaining those soul constructs mean that Lionel had such means already? Why was Kiza so casual about this? How do we deal with this? Kiza leaned back and reclined. What do you mean how do we deal with this? We don't. We are on opposite sides of the supercontinent. His soul constructs won't last the trip all the way over here. Don't you think it's about time the Nova brothers clashed? Let them wear each other down. Kiza took a sip of a drink and closed her eyes. Juan and Droit looked toward one another. They knew Kiza better than anyone. If there was anyone who took Lionel's words the most personally, it was her. She seemed carefree, but she was the most arrogant person they knew. Lionel claiming that he would kill as many as he saw was probably the one thing that actually made her take these air wars seriously. And when Kiza was serious, she didn't have just one plan, she had at least 3. As for what those other 2 were, until the moment they were revealed, maybe no one but her would know. There was maybe nothing more dangerous than a scorned woman. Though, if one said such a thing to Kiza, she would probably kill them without the slightest hesitation. If the person she hated most was Alienor, the person she hated the second most was none other than the Queen's scorned beauty. Chapter 1972. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 1972. Agreement: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1972 Agreement. A tide of violets swept through the dayside supercontinent. Nothing could seem to stop it. Lionel and Little Blackstar took the vanguard, causing death and destruction. Every time they took action, the opposing armies were thrown into chaos and disorder. After they were finished, the strongest of Lionel's subordinates would rush over, splitting up the most powerful combatants and stopping them from having the opportunity to support the more average fights. Then, the army of millions would swoop in. The army of soul constructs was relentless. They maintained the same savage air that they had during the upgrade challenge, their bloodthirst often overwhelming the enemies before them. Even when one managed to hold their ground and fight back, witnessing one rise back from the dead as though they had never been harmed in the first place was enough to shatter even the strongest morale. By the time half of Lionel's 13 or so hours were through, his territory had already expanded by as much as 30% and the hold he had over the dayside supercontinent had begun to approach as much as 60%. He suffocated and suppressed the other territories, and his blade never seemed to show mercy. Given the circumstances, his kill rate had dropped from 100% of heirs. It couldn't be helped, some didn't have the fortitude to stay until the final moments, or the stupidity, depending on how you looked at it. One after another, heirs abandoned their chances at glory and vanished. When they appeared on the glass cube once again, they gasped for breath, their expressions pale and their gazes flickering with fear. In those moments, they had truly felt the scent of death. Seeing the states, flashes of pity couldn't help but spark in the eyes of their elders. True death was one thing, but this sort of death of the heart was another kind altogether. The image of Lionel, standing loftily atop the back of a roaring black dragon was simply far too much for them to handle. Maybe in their lifetimes, they would never be able to raise their heads and face Lionel as equals. In this lifetime, they could only submit. Noah fought valiantly on the battlefield. His saber was bold and his courage was commendable. However, he could only feel that the gap between him and Lionel only seemed to be widening. Much like the elders of the human domain, he too had sensed the fork in the road that Lionel had just faced, and quite frankly if it had been up to him, he wasn't sure if he would have chosen to take this route. Things seemed to be going smoothly now, but Lionel's current actions, his boldness, his trumpeting victories, was only provoking others. It seemed like a simple choice to use an army of millions to face off against groups that were only a few 10,000 at most, but that was only surface-level analysis from those with little understanding of military affairs and war. Noah had spent much of his life on the battlefield, and he knew Lionel wasn't a fool. One of the worst things a military commander could do was to overextend themselves, and there were very strong arguments for the fact that this was what Lionel was doing right this moment. Even so, he stood in the skies with a cold expression. Every time they conquered a territory, he would snatch its city core and leave it ruins. Then, as though it was an adequate replacement, he would leave behind an outpost and move on without a word. He continued to grind away at his enemies, making bold move after bold move. Noah could see that some fatigue was already accumulating along Lionel's brow, but the latter didn't seem to notice. It wasn't a simple task to just reform the destroyed soul constructs. Every time he did so, another bit of his stamina would be sapped away. Although his stars could quickly replenish it, he was wasting more than he was recovering. Even so, the fact that Lionel could sustain millions of soul constructs at all was a great shock. A slight fatigue after what should have been doing something impossible for most was far too difficult to fathom, and yet it was happening right before them all. Seeing Lionel crush the dreams of one heir after another, though, the conflict within Noah's heart only continued to grow. He truly couldn't understand the difference. Were some people simply born better? He knew about Lionel's life. He knew that Lionel was a normal teen of the entertainment stream for most of his life. Other than being a 5-star professional, there was nothing special about him. Whereas he had been a prince of the empire from the day he was born. He had the best teachers, the best resources, the best training. So why was he so inferior? The harsh reality was that Noah knew that Lionel agreed with him as well, not just Lionel, but even his own grandfather. Lionel had always thought he was better than others. The difference was that he felt this betterness was superficial and not enough to calculate the worth of a person. As such, he was determined to use the fact he was simply born better than others to help those around him and create a world where such heartache wasn't necessary. This was why he had always taken these burdens on his shoulders, why he had wanted to be a king and not an emperor. Although his ruthlessness had increased in recent times and his views had shifted somewhat, this was still the very foundation of his being. Emperor Fox, however, was a bit more difficult to read. Even so, his actions seemed to state that he didn't care much about the world at all. He got rid of the useless, slaughtering them en masse. His true goals and aspirations were unknown, but it was safe to say that he wanted to maximize the growth of his empire, even if it meant sacrificing innocence. As for whether there was a deeper layer to that story, only he would know. The irony to Noah, though, was that these two men that he respected greatly, both of them agreed on a fundamental level. There were simply certain barriers one couldn't overcome without being born with a certain advantage others didn't have. The army came to a slow halt. In the distance, the flag of a silver-grade city with walls even taller than Lionel's gold-grade city appeared. 5th Nova's territory. Chapter 1973. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 1973, only as good. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1973, only as good. The armies of 5th Nova had long since prepared, but it wasn't the armies that had made Lionel pause. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the tall walls. He still had 2 wall collapsing exchanges that he hadn't used yet. He simply hadn't run into any enemies that were worth the effort. The Pisk and Quarius families had been the only ones that made the loss worthwhile. But now he realized even without trying that the remaining 2 that he had wouldn't work now. These walls weren't built by a mysterious system, they were almost certainly built by 5th Nova and his subordinates. They were several times more powerful than a gold-grade wall and were probably more powerful than even the air-grade walls would be. One shouldn't take the pre-generated walls lightly. Even the subgrade wall had taken a combined effort of Lionel and Aina resonating their attacks to take it down in one strike. The difference between each subsequent grade of wall was only more exaggerated. During Lionel's battle with Nazag, his territory had been too small to accommodate everyone and as such they had gathered outside, plus their walls had only been at the subgrade and not very useful. When he fought with Armand, their village had only been at the bronze grade and they faced a similar problem with Nazag. Plus, Lionel had descended from the skies back then, making it difficult for even those walls to have much use. However, upon reaching the silver grade, dropping down from the skies was already an impossible workaround as the walls came formulated with a built-in formation that protected both around and above. At the gold grade, this formation was obviously even stronger, and as such, Ramon's self-created walls were even more devastating on the defensive front. Lionel stopped the army because he knew no amount of forward momentum would be able to crush what was before him. He would only waste stamina going headlong without thinking. He couldn't help but silently nod to himself. Indeed, he wasn't the only person in the air wars with such grand methods. he didn't have a monopoly on force crafting or scheming. His fifth cousin was the most silent of the bunch, allowing Valerie to take the reins, but as a man born with both the metal synergy and spear domain lineage factor, he had his own strengths. At that moment, atop the tall silver walls, a young woman, wearing bronze armor and wielding a spear that looked a lot more like a glaive with a blade half the size of her body, appeared. Lionel recognized her at a glance as Valerie. From what Lionel understood, she was one of the last to be born in his father's generation. But in reality, she only counted as such because she was born to parents of his grandfather's generation. The truth was that she couldn't be considered to be a part of the Nebula or Nova generation. Lionel knew very little about her, but of what he did know he understood that she was very unsatisfied with the current Air Wars system. She had only been born with the spear domain lineage factor and as such, hadn't had the right to participate. It also didn't help that she was born sort of in between generations, making the logistics even more difficult on her. Members of the Morales family weren't technically allowed to participate in the Air Wars, so that it didn't seem that the family was supporting one over the other. In addition, this rule minimized infighting and maximized the cohesiveness of the group. Even if a few heirs butted heads, there would be no deaths, and because their family branches wouldn't be involved, the grudges would be at a minimum. However, Valerie had become Ramon's wife, and as a result she was granted a unique exception. Even amongst the Morales family, rumors couldn't help but spread. A strong woman like Valerie was obviously well known, and her fierce personality was even more so. Everyone had thought that she would end up with a man even more headstrong than she was, but to end up with the silent Ramon of all people, no one could have expected such a result, until they suddenly understood. If Valerie was going to fulfill her dream of becoming the heir apparent of the Morales family, who would be a better puppet than Ramon? He was silent, closed off, and even his own family knew very little about him. From the thoughts of others, Valerie strong-arming Ramon into marriage was an easy feat. Valerie, being Valerie, though, never cared to address those rumors. Anyone she caught talking about such things would just taste her blade, and that would be the end of it. Now, however, Valerie stood on top of the walls, her gaze narrowed and sharp. She had been expecting to see a Nova on the other side, but she hadn't expected it to be seventh Nova. If Valerie was honest, she quite liked Lionel. He had given the Morales family a great deal of face with his attitude. Although she was worried that he had spoken a bit too arrogantly and might end up falling hard because of that, the fact that he was here seemed to mean that he had backed up a lot of what he had to say. Even so, seeing that they were enemies now, it didn't dull her blade in the slightest. In fact, it made it stronger. Little Blackstar moved forward until his shadow loomed over the city. By this point, the moon was looming high in the skies, but with Blackstar's appearance, his head overshadowed it, casting a mighty darkness over the city. At this moment, many of Fifth Nova's subordinates had been resting, but upon hearing the commotion, they immediately lined up. They had known that something was coming, but even so, they had slept like babies. With a single glance, Lionel could see just how well trained these warriors were, and the look of respect they gave toward Valerie was an even more striking sign. Archers lined the walls and prepared for battle. They all held real bows and powerful arrows. Lionel knew that even if he crushed their bow force, the power of the crafts backing them would be enough to do some real damage. A single one of those arrows could kill a gold-grade threat. If they sent volley after volley, within a few minutes he would be drained of dream force even if he revived them all. Lionel analyzed the situation quite quickly. There was no doubt that this would be his greatest challenge since stepping foot into the Air Wars. Even so, his gaze was calm. Little Blackstar lowered his head until Lionel was eye level with Valerie. He smiled slightly for the first time since entering this place. It was clear that he treated them far differently than he did the others he had come across. I guess I should call you Big Sis, right? Let's have a good battle. These walls though. I'm afraid they aren't enough. Valerie's gaze softened somewhat before they sharpened once again into a sneer. She raised her spear and pointed it at Lionel's head, but at the same time, Lionel had raised his arms, his left kidney beginning to shine with a burning glow. A formation is only as good as its weaknesses, Lionel said softly. Within the core of the city, Ramon's eyes suddenly snapped open. Chapter 1974. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 40 seconds AM. Chapter 1974. Weaknesses if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1974 Weaknesses. Lionel Irises danced with complex runes that fused and separated before fusing once more. A great feeling of danger suddenly took hold of Valerie and she felt like something she should stop was about to happen. But before she could, dozens of fireballs appeared in the skies, the temperature skyrocketing as they descended quicker than Valerie could react. Bang! 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 There didn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to the descending balls of fire, but every collision caused a quake that rocked the city. By the time the third had descended, the invisible barrier had taken shape and become very real, cracks spreading across its transparent surface. By the time the sixth descended, the walls had begun to shake as well, their structural integrity seemingly in jeopardy. Then, suddenly, all of the remaining over dozen descended at once. The reaction was immediate. The invisible barrier cracked like glass, motes of light descending from above in a beautiful, yet tragic sort of way. The balls of fire only continued to rain downward, setting fire to the city and laying waste to much of what was in its path. Valerie's expression changed. She understood Ramon's skill quite well. By this point, he had already overshadowed many of the older generation in terms of his force crafting. There shouldn't have been anyone amongst the heirs that was his match in this regard, and that was only further proven by the gold-grade armors that fitted each and every one of their warriors. Ramon hadn't slept a single wink since the air wars began. Even though the fatigue had set in for him long ago, he only continued to press forward. Valerie had seen his hard work personally, and she knew how meticulous he was. There was simply no way he would have made any large mistakes that could be so easily explored. In that case, the only explanation was that Lionel was just far superior to him. The only thing stopping Lionel from forging true eighth-dimensional treasures currently was a lack of force strength and little Tolly's limitations. He had already stepped through the boundary of the life grade, and the gap between that and the gold grade could only be said to be enormous. There was simply no other explanation. What Ramon saw was a perfect construction, one that he had poured his blood and sweat into. In terms of gold grade constructions, it was probably among the best possible, period. However, what Lionel saw was a construct that wasn't whole. The definition of the life grade wasn't a level of strength. Rather, it represented a product that was so perfectly synergized that it seemed to have life, a product so perfect that it seemed as though the universe itself had created it. Ramon's construction, however, was far from that, and to Lionel, every point of imperfect synchronization was only another weakness. A weakness that could be exploited. Despite the change, Valerie reacted quickly. Fire at will. Her roar echoed across the skies. The archers raised their bows, but with a flicker of Lionel's radiant crown, their bow force winked out one after another. Before the archers could respond to the change, Lionel's brothers, Aina and the others charged. Little Blackstar whipped his tail out just once and they were all sent flying with great speed toward the walls. The moment they landed, a catastrophe seemed to have descended and the archers were thrown into complete disarray. Lionel reached out a palm and leapt forward, a black rod billowing dense fog darker than even the night sky appearing in his hand as he swung down toward Valerie. Though Valerie was shocked, she pivoted once more. She slid a foot back, gliding into an attack stance before piercing out toward Lionel's chest. If her attack landed, there was no doubt Lionel wouldn't even get the chance to step onto the walls. Lionel's gaze narrowed. What a perfect spear strike. Valerie's skill had returned to simplicity. Unfortunately. What good was a spear against Lionel? Just as Lionel had this thought, though, Valerie's spear strike smoothly turned into a javelin's throw, a strong bronze force coating it as she threw it. She had known long ago that Lionel had the spear domain ring and had lured him forward as such on purpose, lulling him with a false sense of security. Lionel's expression flickered. She hadn't used any spear force, and even if her spear crumbled, the force surrounding it definitely wouldn't. It was already too late to change his spear trajectory, but with a thought, 2 more stars appeared to Lionel's back. 10 stars shone with radiant splendor, 3 silver, 3 sky blue, 2 red gold, and 2 dark ocean blue. His aura changed and reached its peak, the presence of the heavenly body realm finally shining forth in full effect. Ever since he had shifted his perspective on universal force, this was the very first time Lionel had unleashed it fully. Before, the aura of universal force was far too subtle as it could only be displayed when he brought forth all of his stars. But now, there was no denying it. The human domain was shocked once more. They had never seen a heavenly body realm like this, a heavenly body realm that was so perfect, so powerful. Void star force descended and formed a force art before Lionel that quickly solidified into a shield. The moment the force art was completed, more runes formed within his 2 void star force stars, strengthening them once more, but he didn't seem to notice at all as his spear continued to descend toward Valerie. Valerie's pupils constricted. She was still in a throwing motion, she wasn't in any condition to counterattack, she could only raise her forearm. But right then, an action that looked like a desperate attempt, shifted. The slots in her armor's forearm opened up and formed a round shield, meeting Lionel's spear tip head-on. Bang! Valerie was sent flying, her body streaking through the air like a shooting star. Chapter 1975. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 39 seconds AM. Chapter 1975, right now. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1975 right now. Valerie crashed into the building below as Lionel landed on the city walls. But just as soon as she did, she leapt to her feet, her battle intent blazing. With a flick of her wrist, the warped and broken shield was flung to the side and she brandished her fists. She didn't have the metal synergy lineage factor, so she obviously didn't have her own divine armor. The armor that Ramon had forged for her was already extremely excellent, and yet it couldn't survive a single strike against Lionel's spear. It was clear that that spear was above the gold grade. Even though Valerie found herself unable to use spear force and wearing armor that was practically useless to her, she still brandished her fists. Lionel looked down for a moment. Despite the carnage around him, his mind seemed to be silent. The archers had recovered after their first fall. Although they realized they couldn't use their bow force for whatever reason, they immediately switched their tactics. At the same time, the non-archers below and near the city quickly gathered, prepared to battle just as James reached the door mechanisms and forced the gates open for the tide of 3 million soul constructs to rush in. Lionel met Valerie's gaze and hesitated. He almost put his spear away, but after seeing the look in her eye, he tightened his grip instead. "All right," he said lightly. "In that case." Lionel's stars suddenly pulsed and they grew a size. Each had been barely a meter across each, but they suddenly expanded to 2, then 3, then suddenly reached 10. The flood of universal force increased like a rising tide. The skies rumbled and the earth quaked. The skies above had been quite dark, but motes of lights began to quickly accumulate, each matching one of the colors of Lionel's heavenly body realm stars. Lionel raised a foot and by the time it descended, his body had flickered and vanished. He was a blinding streak in the skies, activating star fusion, king's might, and descending with a mighty momentum. One spear to connect the earth and skies. The black rod in Lionel's hands suddenly became a pillar of dark gold. At that moment, Ramon rushed out from the core of the city. The bags under his eyes had grown to the point they were blackened. Even so, his eyes shone like stars, a far cry from the timid gaze he had seemed to have the first time Lionel met him. When he saw Lionel's strike about to land, his expression changed and he rushed forward, but it was already too late. Valerie struck out with her fist. A surprising amount of fist force coated it as he roared, some of the hints of simplicity that had coated her spear transitioning toward her fist. Lionel seemed struck by it at first. How long had it been since he used fist force? Longer than he could remember. Why was this fist so beautiful, though? Despite its beauty, it didn't seem to matter. When Lionel's spear descended, Valerie's fist only paused it for a moment before her arms split apart like pressurized wood. Her eyes rolled back from the pain, her forearm combusting into a rain of blood and gore. She was sent flying back once more, sliding along the ground and leaving a bloody trail as she fell to Ramon's feet. Ramon's eyes widened as he hurried forward. Valerie? Valerie. Ramon slid along his knees to her side, his brown eyes colored with anguish. He didn't seem to know what to do. He wanted to help her, but he also didn't dare to touch her for fear of making it all worse. His hands approached and retreated again and again, a flustered expression taking over him. He looked up to find the crumbling pieces of his formation still falling. Despair colored his gaze. No, it wasn't despair, it was guilt, a heavy guilt that sunk like cold in the winter or darkness in the deepest pits. Lionel recognized that gaze. It was the same gaze he had had when he watched his subordinates die one after another in the Valiant Heart Zone, subordinates that he would no longer see again now due to his own selfishness. Given Ramon's reaction alone, one could tell that the rumors about the two were nothing more than nonsense. Ramon finally reached forward and held Valerie up, if for nothing other than not wanting her to rest her head on the hard ground any longer. Valerie coughed, blood flying from her lips. Her eyes regained some focus and she looked up. Her eyes softened somewhat when she saw Ramon's tears, but then she began to push him away, coughing and wheezing all the while. "You big dope, I'm not going to die, it's just an arm, what are you doing? You're embarrassing me. How can my husband be such a crybaby?" Ramon clenched his teeth, but his tears didn't stop falling. It was his fault, it was all his fault. He didn't make a formation that was strong enough. If only he had been better, if only he had held up his end of the bargain, this would have never happened. Ramon looked toward Lionel, a fierce glare in his eyes. But at that moment, Valerie reached for his collar with her only good remaining hand and stopped him. "Forget it. He has the spear domain ring and there are probably others eyeing us right now. There's no use in fighting amongst ourselves. A Morales has to win this, for maybe the first time in their relationship," though. Ramon didn't listen to Valerie. He grabbed her wrist and pulled, forcing her to loosen her grip as he stood with a dark expression hanging between his brows. He walked toward Lionel with heavy steps, bronze runes forming all along his body as his halo took form and his divine armor began to appear piece by piece. Valerie watched his back with a complicated expression, weakness overtaking her. Ramon had been quite like Armand, not caring much about these air wars and never wanting to participate in the first place. It was only because of Valerie and the face of the Morales family that he had done so. But right now, he wasn't a Morales, nor was he an heir, or a genius fighting for glory. Right now, he was nothing more than an enraged husband. Chapter 1976. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1976. Third, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1976. Third, Lionel and Ramon's gazes met, the latter filled with rage and the former as cool as an iceberg. Internally, though, Lionel sighed. He couldn't say that he hadn't expected something like this to happen, but this also made the situation 100 times more complicated to handle. He hadn't wanted to harm Valerie so much, but there were two reasons he had no choice but to. The first was time. He didn't have the time to be soft-hearted and battle it out with his fists. The second reason was because not going all out would only be an insult to her. While to outsiders it seemed that he was relying on the spear domain ring, he himself knew quite well that even if he took the ring off right this moment, it wouldn't change anything. His sovereignty had transcended the need for the spear domain ring. Now, however, he was faced with another choice once again. Would he go easy on Ramon? Suddenly, Lionel's heart skipped a beat. Ramon's fist had appeared right before his face and he hadn't sensed it until it was too late. Bang! Lionel's head snapped to the side and he took a heavy step back. His divine armor quaked once and dispersed the damage, but his pupils were still constricted. What was that just now? Ramon's fist appeared before Lionel again, but Lionel took a light step on the ground, retreating and expanding the distance between them, but somehow, Ramon's fist remained before him. Lionel raised his spear to block, but Ramon's fist flickered past it, landing heavily on his chest. Bang! 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 Lionel's feet slammed into the ground 3 times in succession, each one driving him back further and cracking the earth beneath him. The amount of force that his armor was dispersing even caused the ground to seem to implode, as though a pressurized geyser was erupting from within. My senses are being distorted. No, they aren't being distorted, it's as though he's using blind spots to take advantage of me. But how could my internal sight have blind spots? More importantly, how could my vision have blind spots? Lionel's gaze flickered, his eyes landing on Ramon's armor. He realized after just a split moment of deduction that it was Ramon's armor. It was definitely his divine armor doing it. If Lionel was correct, the core piece of his armor should be a Dream Force domain type ore, but he couldn't sense the exact ore, which meant that just like he had with his self-created formation, Ramon had self-created an alloy for his divine armor. Lionel had done this before, so he knew exactly how difficult it was to fuse unruly 7th-dimensional ores into a single holistic piece. To do so with Dream Force type ores was even more obscene. It was less accurate to say that Ramon was wearing a gold-grade armor, and far more accurate to say that he had taken a half-step into the life grade as well. There was no doubt that if it wasn't for Lionel, Ramon would be the strongest crafter of the Nova generation. There's only one way. Lionel deduced. Lionel crossed his spear over his body again, but it was fruitless. Ramon's strikes were becoming harder to handle, and more powerful. Lionel could sense that Ramon's fatigue was slowly fading as he pumped more and more Dream Force into his body. As his fatigue faded, his strikes became more precise and more powerful. The jarring feeling of his organs being displaced shook Lionel awake. Ramon's power was getting to the point where even his divine armor was being overloaded. If there was anyone who was surprised, though, it was Ramon. Lionel had taken several direct shots and was clearly trying his best to block and failing. He had aimed for several vital points that should have left him entirely incapacitated. How could a divine armor forged by a 6th-dimensional expert had such great defense? Suddenly, Ramon's eyes widened. First he was focused on Valerie, then he had lost himself in rage when he faced Lionel, so this was the first time he noticed that Lionel's divine armor was actually of the life grade. How was that possible? At that moment, Lionel's body expanded, rising to over 3 meters tall and gaining an additional 2 pairs of arms and a pair of heads. Activating his panda construct, Lionel unleashed his starry spirit domain. In that moment, his internal sight was swapped for his dream world and the world became countless times clearer. Ramon's invisible dream domain came into sight and Lionel could sense the distortions. This time when Ramon punched forward, Lionel punched out with a free hand himself, meeting knuckle to knuckle. Boom! They both took a single step back, their forearms trembling. Ramon's eyes narrowed beneath his visor. He didn't know what had changed, but he too could sense a shift in the atmosphere. He immediately deduced that Lionel had deployed a domain as well, likely a sensory one. Even so, Ramon was unmoved as he pushed forward again, his single fist suddenly becoming 2, then 3. Lionel's gaze narrowed as he brandished his spear, striking out once and yet meeting all 3 fists at the same time. But to his shock, all 3 spear blades missed and Ramon's fist appeared before him again. That was when Lionel realized that this couldn't just be a distortion of Dream Force. His affinity in Dream Force was too high and he couldn't be so easily tricked. There was an underlying spatial force that Ramon had only just unleashed. Lionel's divine armor cracked and he coughed up a mouthful of blood, his body trembling as his heels left a deep trench in the ground. By the time he looked up, Ramon was already before him once again, bearing down with a fierce momentum. Lionel could practically see 2 red irises behind the latter's visor. Lionel coughed again and took a break. He activated his Starry Star domain and then his Lotus domain, his battle intent soaring. His ideas of going easy on Ramon seemed like nothing more than a joke now. This was the Air Wars, this was an heir of the Morales family, weakness didn't run through them. The lines of dream force and spatial force became clear in Lionel's eyes. Pushing his Lotus domain to the limits, he stripped Ramon of his spatial force and made use of the time force that it produced to strengthen the unpredictability of his blade. But at that moment, a third force descended from Ramon's domain. Chapter 1977. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1977. A genius. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1977. A genius. Lionel was certain after a single look. It was breaking force, the very force designed to break rules and surpass expectations, the very force known for shedding limits and shattering them. At that moment, Lionel's Lotus domain overloaded and crumbled. It didn't seem capable of fathoming an opposing force to breaking force. The three layers of Ramon's forces came together and his fists suddenly blotted out the skies. They came from all directions and no direction at the same time. It overloaded Lionel's senses, almost as though he didn't have enough minds to finish the calculation, but that was absolutely impossible. No matter how powerful Ramon was, he couldn't possibly form millions of variables, and Lionel had at least that many minds. There was only one explanation. The breaking force was impeding his calculation ability. Lionel was almost never impressed. His standards were exceptionally high, and he thought even higher of himself. He didn't tend to be impressed by things he felt that he could do. But this divine armor of Ramon's. What a genius. Lionel felt another fist crash into his chest. Half of his panda construct was ripped to shreds and the remaining impact collided with him, dealing him the worst injury he had suffered since entering the air wars. Heavy breathing forced Lionel to swallow more blood than he would have liked. Half of his body hung out from his panda construct, his chest a mess of flesh. This Ramon sure was interesting. He was the most inconspicuous, but if not for Lionel, the odds of him winning these air wars were exceptionally high. Lionel felt the most pressure from Adworth, but after interacting with Ramon, he felt that it should actually probably be a 50-50 split between the two of them. He had really run into a buzzing chainsaw this time. Let alone Lionel, even Valerie was very much surprised. She didn't know much about Ramon's combat strength because he never fought. He was famously still a galaxy-ranked disciple despite being in the 7th dimension because he refused to battle to this extent. However, it could be said that this wasn't a display of combat strength, per se. This was a display of his magnum opus, the craft he had poured the most blood, sweat, and tears into, his divine armor. Crush your badge and apologize to my wife later, and I will let you go. Ramon said coldly. Lionel couldn't help but laugh inwardly. The whole apology to his wife later was clearly Ramon's attempt to save some face for Lionel. He knew that human domain was watching, and forcing Lionel to apologize for what was effectively him doing what he should be doing was too much. Despite his situation, Lionel found it a bit adorable. He definitely didn't have the capability of being so level-headed. If someone had shattered Ana's arm, even if she could practically instantly heal it, he would have probably lost his mind. Morales or not, the suffering of whoever had done it would be great. I will let you know that I haven't brought out my full strength. Even without my spear, I still have my other trump cards and my ability index. You've done well enough, don't force my hand. Lionel suddenly took a deep breath, causing raging winds to surge forward from all directions. The violent vortex ruffled both Lionel and Ramon's hair. Ramon's gaze narrowed as Lionel's injuries seemed to heal in practically the blink of an eye. In just a few seconds, his blood was trickling down from smooth and unblemished bronzed skin. A rushing aura surged out from Lionel, and the rest of his panda construct shattered as he fell from within it and landed on the ground. He shook his head, pointing his spear down toward the ground as the bronze aura around him suddenly began to tremble, becoming slowly brighter and brighter. Noted, Lionel said lightly. Batum. Lionel's heartbeat was like a roaring beast, echoing over the city and causing a wild earthquake. But I still have a few tricks up my sleeve as well. At that moment, Lionel's halo suddenly expanded and began to trail down the length of his body. Ramon and those watching couldn't help but frown. Lionel should have already taken out his divine armor before. How could a trump card be something you have already taken out already? But right then, what should have been something they had already seen before became something decidedly different. The design of the armor was entirely different. With every movement, its joints and valves expanded and contracted. It looked almost like a living, breathing creature. While it carried the same pearly white and jade green colors, it also had an added black accent to it that made it look decidedly more dark and powerful. As the first streams of vital star force slowly closed the distance toward it from Lionel's vital star, the world seemed to fall into silence. When the streams finally entered the armor. Rumble. A piercing light howled into the skies. Lionel opened his arms wide. The amount of vitality coursing through his body made him feel wide awake. It felt as though he could shatter the world with a single step. Lionel raised his foot and Ramon's pupils constricted instantly. The latter retreated, ready to expand the distance, but Lionel had somehow already appeared before him. Bang! Ramon didn't even realize when Lionel's fist had landed on his abdomen. He only vaguely noted that his divine armor had shattered to pieces. Lionel quickly retracted his fist, feeling that he would have pierced right through Ramon's stomach in that moment. However, his mercy is exactly what caused Ramon's body to shoot out like an iron ball from a cannon, streaking through the air with such speed that a harsh whistling sound filled the air. Lionel landed lightly on the ground, looking forward. He didn't seem surprised by the result at all, but the same couldn't be said for the remainder of the human domain. No one seemed to know how to respond. Lionel had taken out a second life-grade divine armor. Chapter 1978. Published at 3rd of July 2023 8:21 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1978. Big difference if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1978. Big difference. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. The gap between the strengths of his divine armors were enormous. Vital star force was a high-level force and maximizing its usage required materials that were equally as high-level. Just now, Lionel leapt from a pseudo-life grade of the 4th dimension to one of the 5th dimension. The gap didn't need to be described. Ramon's domain was only as solid as the defenses of his divine armor, and was only as useful as the weakness of his enemies. While Lionel didn't have a way to counter it, there was always the most obvious method remaining: absolute strength. Lionel felt a glare on him and he looked toward it to find Valerie, who had already stumbled to Ramon's side. He could only sigh. What else was he supposed to do in this situation exactly? Luckily, Valerie seemed to understand and shook her head. Looking around, she knew they had lost. It would take several days, maybe even weeks, for Ramon's divine armor to repair itself, and it had clearly been his greatest trump card. They didn't have any more chances. With a sigh, Valerie found the badge in Ramon's chest pocket and crushed it. Very quickly, he, as well as all of his subordinates, vanished. The sounds of battle came to an end, but Lionel looked up toward the skies with a frown. Usually, he would keep his starry spirit domain activated at all times. His dream world gave far sharper clarity and was much less easily fooled than his internal sight, so it was a no-brainer so long as he had the stamina. However, when he entered the air wars, he had kept it in reserve. The first reason was because while he could hold it up with great ease in the outside world, there was a great suppression here that drained him quickly, especially when he used Dream Force. The second reason was because the range wasn't large enough to give him a huge advantage regardless. His internal sight was 10 kilometers, but his dream world only extended for 100 meters now. When he used his second-tier divine armor, though, this range expanded to just over a kilometer, though the range of his internal sight remained the same. Just now, he had caught a whiff of something his internal sight had missed. Those resonating strings. Libra family, huh? Lionel had learned quite a bit by reading what the Void Library had to offer. In return, he had a surface to mid-level understanding of every prominent lineage factor in the human domain and even some of other races from what wars and battles had gathered. When he saw the faint string of linked soul force, he recognized it immediately. He also wasn't surprised. Since he had known about their abilities, he also had guessed that they would use it like this. Lionel's lips suddenly curled and he flickered and vanished. His speed was ridiculous, leaving a trail of blue in his wake as his figure was almost impossible to track with the naked eye. He had appeared before the Libra family members before they even understood what was happening. He reached out, grabbing their head. They immediately tried to fight back, but if even Ramon couldn't withstand a single strike, how could they? They found their legs dangled in the air as their arms squirmed about, but no amount of punching or kicking seemed to do a thing. If Lionel's first armor had sturdy defenses, this one was practically an impenetrable wall. The Libra family member felt as though they were punching against the wall, and suddenly, they felt nothing. Lionel shattered their neck with a single squeeze. Why would he waste time interrogating a living person when he could take everything he needed from their soul with much greater ease? Resume the connection with your sibling, Lionel commanded. Yes. The Libra family member reacted almost too eagerly, but this was simply the power of the king's might lineage factor. With a flicker, Lionel vanished and killed yet another Libra family just as they were grieving the loss of their brother. The change was abrupt and it seemed to happen without cause. Even now, those watching had yet to recover from the appearance of a second life-grade armor when the two had died in quick succession. The Libra family elders were standing close with the Gamine family members. They were worried about Lionel's display, but they felt that their people were in a good position. With their experience, the things that the heiress of the Gamine family had deduced, they had as well, so they knew that Lionel shouldn't last much longer. But this sudden change had caught them completely off guard. This wasn't the first time they had seen this ability of Lionel's, but the visceral disgust they felt towards seeing it in this light was like a punch to the gut. Watching a grieving sibling suddenly begin groveling at the feet of the man who would have otherwise felt great hatred for moments ago, they felt shivers down their spines. Ramon and Valerie had just appeared in the range of the Morales family members and were quickly taken in. When they saw that Lionel was actually slaughtering people, their expressions changed once more. While they knew Lionel had been merciful with them, seeing his ruthlessness painted a completely different picture. Lionel, though, didn't seem to care about this at all. He had already warned these people once. Their shivers, their disgust, if anything, was only able to make him sneer. Lionel stood before the two constructs for a moment before waving his hand and sending them away. His conversation with them seemed to be brief, but he also seemed to be satisfied with it. His figure vanished once more, and when he appeared again, he had already taken the core of Ramon's city and begun to move forward, his divine armor fading. It was interesting. One of the main reasons he chose to use his lower-level divine armors first outside of hiding his strength for the moment was due to the stamina drain he knew they would have. But to his surprise, it wasn't very taxing at all. That was when Lionel remembered there was a big change between now and when he had created his divine armors. His metal synergy lineage factor was currently 8th dimensional. Lionel's lip curled. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.